Welcome to this third and final day of Atlantic Forum's Autumn Conference. My name is Petra Cicvaric and I'm a conference chair. Hello and good morning. Welcome to this third and final day of Atlantic Forum's Autumn Conference. My name is Petra Cicvaric and I'm a conference chair. Yesterday we had a unique opportunity to welcome Chair of the NATO Military Committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, to the floor as our keynote address, where we had a chance to hear his personal take on why is it so important to expect the unexpected at all times in all of the domains. Following his remarkable address, we looked into lawfare, a notion that we have started to unpack during our spring conference, and yesterday we had a chance to dig deeper into legal discontinuities and see what we can further do to enhance our resilience and preparedness within this particular domain. Following that discussion, we looked into space. We looked into how we can further establish a sustainable and a long-term geostrategy in space in this brand new domain that we have started to discover. After a quick lunch break, we looked into cyber. We were joined by subject matter experts to look into why it is so important to engage the young professionals within this particular domain, especially looking into emerging and disruptive technologies. We also looked into how we can further enhance our resilience within this particular domain by looking into how non-state and state actors are behaving within it. To finish off the day, we looked into hybrid warfare. We were joined by remarkable subject matter experts in the field who gave us an insight into what we can improve further to create a better resilience that we already have. We looked into it from a legal perspective, from intelligence perspective, cyber perspective, technological perspective, data perspective. We tried to take an all-encompassing, enriching, holistic approach to the topic to unpack it as much as the time allowed us. So, building on all of those notions, we have come to an end of this 3-day-long journey, and today we will have a chance to hear from Assistant Secretary General David Van Wiel, who is here to talk to us about disruptive emerging technologies, climate change, and all of the aspects that are lying ahead of us as challenges that we need to be ready for. After his remarkable address, we will have a chance to unpack climate change and discontinuities, to look into discontinuities within this particular area by looking into it beyond the weather. To finish off the day, we will look into political systems and the political side of the alliance to see how we can further prepare our regimes and states from a political perspective for the looming discontinuities that are lying ahead. Without taking too much of your time, I would just like to kindly remind you to join us our discussions here under the live stream on YouTube. You can also join us in Slido by asking your questions and engaging in your polls. The QR code and the link are here on the bottom of the screen, so you can just scan it and join to us in discovering how we can further prepare NATO for resilience and the challenges of tomorrow. And now, without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Assistant Secretary General for Disruptive and Emerging Technologies, David Van Wiel, to the floor.
You win again, extraterrestrial beast. Games are just a fun way to waste time, right? Not necessarily. Playing games could lead to new ways to combat modern threats. That's what we're looking at today in NATO Science. Around the world, people spend billions of hours a week playing games. But what if, rather than playing games aimlessly, we could divert this time and effort into solving security problems? Our scientist in Ankara has more.
I always remember a military trainer telling me, I have students playing Fortnite and I'm trying to teach them use
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to address this dynamic forum of young professionals. The Atlantic Forum is the perfect place to debate the key security issues of today and the challenges of tomorrow. We are currently witnessing a transformation of international security that we still need to grasp in all its dimensions. We are witnessing a shift away from threats that are strictly territorial, mostly visible and mostly kinetic, towards a mix of deterritorialized threats that are less visible, less kinetic, but no less dangerous. How well we learn to cope with these new challenges will determine our security in the future. And I'd like to give you today a NATO perspective on the emerging security challenges and the ambitious agenda for the Alliance for meeting them. Specifically, I want to refer to countering the implications of climate change, building our cyber resilience, and leveraging emerging and disruptive technologies. This year's NATO summit was particularly ambitious and addressed all these areas as a high priority. Allied heads of state and government agreed on a number of deliverables that will be key to future-proof our alliance. I will be starting with climate change and security. Climate change is a defining challenge of our time. It affects each and every one of us, it impacts all our activities, and it poses new threats. It's NATO's aim to become the leading international organization on the impact of climate change on security, and I will try to explain how. The challenge that climate change poses to our security and our resilience will be enormous. It will redraw the map, geographically, economically, politically, and in terms of security. The increase in extreme weather events will trigger an increase in natural disasters such as famines or floods. The political and economic stability, particularly of poorer states, will be put at risk. We will probably have less arable land, more droughts, more bad harvests. And the result will be rising food prices, which will again hurt the ones that are already at a disadvantage. Rising sea levels and the desertification of large areas could trigger migration flows, and disputes over inhabitable land or drinking water could erupt into military conflict. But climate change is not only a threat multiplier. It will also determine where and how our forces will have to operate. We've already seen that a strategic environment that is being altered by a changing climate poses challenges of considerable magnitude, and there are numerous examples of that. In Afghanistan, helicopter engines had to be replaced because the heat reduced their performance. Rising temperatures in Iraq are putting a heavy burden on our soldiers. Their combat suits are not designed for temperatures around 50 degrees or higher. and the changing salinity of the water in the Gulf of Aden has led turbines of frigates to fail. All of these developments point in the same direction. If NATO wants to continue protecting the safety and security of its 900 million citizens, it needs to address the challenge of climate change head-on. At our last summit in June, we made it clear that we mean what we say. We agreed an ambitious climate change and security action plan, and this action plan will set the stage for NATO's contribution to meeting the challenge of climate change. NATO is looking at climate change and security from the four perspectives of awareness, adaptation, mitigation, and outreach to partners. Raising awareness will be achieved through conducting a comprehensive analysis of the consequences of climate change for installations, assets, missions, and operations. And this will ensure that we have a common understanding of what we're up against. Adaptation means mainstreaming climate issues into the full range of NATO's activities. This includes, for example, defense planning, civil emergency planning, standardization, military exercises, and disaster relief. Our procurement policy will also not remain unaffected. Mitigation, the third pillar, means that NATO delivers on its commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the board. We will develop an analytical methodology for measuring military greenhouse gas emissions, and this should help allies in gradually reducing the CO2 emissions in the military. The final pillar, outreach, means enhancing exchanges with partner countries and with other institutions that are active on climate change and security issues, such as the UN and the European Union. Equally, we will reach out to civil society, and starting next year we will organize a major annual event on the topic of climate change and security. As I said, our action plan is very ambitious. Hence, implementing it requires a lot of political will. But it also requires a political narrative that reflects the true nature of our efforts. A realistic narrative that doesn't raise false hopes about what can be achieved or in what time frame. One thing is clear. NATO is ready to make a tangible contribution to meeting the challenge of climate change. Now let me turn to the second key theme of my remarks, cyber resilience. Cyber attacks have become a major threat to the stability and security of modern-day societies. That's why NATO has been dealing with cyber defense for quite some time. However, with cyber threats becoming ever more frequent, complex, and destructive, we need to step up our efforts to face this evolving challenge. The reality is that a range of actors, including hostile states and criminals, are seeking to gain advantage in cyberspace. And it's hard to imagine a conflict in the future that would not include a cyber dimension. This means that NATO needs to be just as effective in cyberspace as we are on land, in the air, and at sea. And with this in mind, allies have adopted a new comprehensive cyber defense policy at the summit earlier this summer. This policy provides a framework for addressing cyber resilience in the broader context of our defense and deterrence posture. But it also recognized NATO's role as a platform for enhancing and contributing to allied countries' national cyber defense and resilience. The new policy also provides guidance on how the alliance would respond to sustained low-level malicious cyber activities, which individually may not pose high risk, but can accumulate to a level where NATO's collective defense might be considered as necessary. The true strategic consequence of malicious activities in cyberspace may lie not in producing the catastrophic armed attack that disables a country in a single surprise moment. Nevertheless, the accumulation of smaller level activities can affect and undermine the sources of national power without such a large attack. As such, we need to be ready to respond to a series of actions and their effects rather than a single one. Those wishing to initiate such actions need to thus gauge our likely response to them and their aggregated effects as a whole, not just individually. In terms of the types of response that NATO might take, one notable development has been using a measure envisaged in the new policy, which is public collective expressions of condemnations by allies on the implications of malicious cyber activities and cyber attacks. This is one way for NATO to express solidarity with those affected by malicious cyber activities, but more importantly, to call out unacceptable behavior and reinforce norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. This is part of a comprehensive approach to holding the perpetrators accountable, denying benefit to them, but also imposing cost. While cyber resilience of allied countries is a national responsibility, it is also a collective commitment. And one of the key tools for boosting our cyber resilience is the Cyber Defense Pledge. It was adopted in 2016 in Warsaw, and the pledge has since helped to focus attention on cyber defense and promote and prioritize investment, both financial and human resources. It's a unique transatlantic expression of policy priorities to secure national infrastructures and networks. And then last but not least, new technologies and innovation are fast becoming fundamental to our security environment. As emerging and disruptive technologies transform the way in which we and our potential adversaries will operate, it is critical that NATO takes an active role at the vanguard of innovation. New technologies, such as artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, or biotechnologies, will fundamentally change the way we defend ourselves and how we think about security. And in fact, they're already doing so. As NATO, we have therefore decided to leverage the emerging and disruptive technologies to maintain our technological edge, to ensure our military superiority, and ultimately to strengthen our defense and deterrence. However, the challenge is not the development, but the speed of adoption of these technologies that will allow us to maintain our technological edge over our competitors and adversaries. We recognize that our most innovative technologies are no longer developed by the government, but instead by our private sector and academia, and they're financed by the private sector for commercial purposes. Therefore, Allied leaders have agreed at the last summit to launch an ambitious innovation initiative to strengthen transatlantic technology cooperation. And we are launching Diana, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, which will include a civil-military NATO accelerator for allied startups with the aim of solving defense and security problems. Similarly, the proposed NATO Innovation Fund will be a powerful tool to support and invigorate our nation's innovation ecosystems as they develop technologies key to our security and defense. These initiatives are important because where NATO can really add value is in ensuring that innovation efforts stay focused on the end user, our military. Nowadays, with the private sector leading the way in innovation, NATO must adapt to meaningfully engage with all actors to ensure that the development and the adoption of EDTs is underpinned by our democratic values. NATO has to build trust with the entities it works with, and who may not immediately feel comfortable incorporating in the defense and security environment. And this is why NATO has put ethics at the center of its innovation efforts. What separates us from our adversaries is that we pursue innovation and adoption of new technologies while upholding our democratic norms and values. Allies have the ambition to establish NATO as a thought leader when it comes to the ethical use of new technologies in the defense environment. We will define ethical approaches to all new technologies that we are facing. And by doing so, we aim to build trust between allies, between allied militaries, and with the allied innovation ecosystems. In addition, the alliance wishes to set an example globally. And the best example of our work towards this end is that the allies have negotiated the very first NATO Principles of Responsible Use for Artificial Intelligence in defense, and made these available to the public last month. All in all, the Principles of Responsible Use will be central to NATO's approach to innovation, because innovators and researchers need to trust that we treat our ethical responsibilities and legal obligations with the utmost respect they require. Furthermore, this forms an integral part of the doctrinal, legal, and policy basis for future interoperability. Ladies and gentlemen, as an alliance devoted to security, NATO has a responsibility to understand the evolving threats we face and to take steps to ensure we can defend ourselves. We have a responsibility to look forward, to anticipate future threats. And we have to consider how rapidly developing new technologies may change the nature of conflict. Our defenses must be able to learn how skilled adversaries can attack our systems and exploit vulnerabilities of which we may not even be aware. The 3 lines of work that I've just described to you are critical to maintaining the alliance's strategic advantage and ensuring the safety and security of our populations, for now and in the years to come. The good thing is that within NATO we're not alone. We have 30 allies to share the lessons learned with. And we also recognize that NATO as an organization doesn't need to make it alone. We are reaching out to all of our partners, governments, industry, as well as civil society. We're engaging with new actors from the private sector and academia, and we're building trust. We also need the cooperation and contribution of smart young professionals of all allied countries, like yourselves, that are interested in international security and committed to reinforcing the values of democracy, rule of law, peace and security. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you all a very productive day.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our very last day of the Atlantic Forum Autumn Conference 2021. Today, I will be a moderator of panel Beyond the Weather, the security impact of climate discontinuities. As we may all know, the climate change is real. I am saying this because despite its seriousness, the biggest challenge that had to be tackled was the trust of society that something like this actually exists. The science was here since, let's say, 1980s. People were listening to science and experts that the climate change is happening, but they started to understand it only a couple years ago, especially the fact that we, the human beings, have a considerable stake in this change. Today, it is not a delusion that the climate change is a serious issue, that it impacts our lives, and much more. For example, security framework and NATO. Because of climate change, we witness serious droughts, floods, immigration, and probably the most important aspect, which is not oil, but always be the water. I think that I just mentioned more than 10 times words such as serious, important, significant, and still it is not enough for expressing the urgent need to tackle this phenomenon. This panel will address the impact of climate change on security and on NATO, but we will not be able to solve the whole issue being climate change here within 70 minutes. Therefore, I asked our speakers beforehand to prepare one key message or vision to address the question: what is the most crucial challenge that NATO faces in terms of climate change? And what actions should be taken into consideration to better tackle this long-term discontinuity? In other words, what is, in their view, the most challenging for NATO in terms of climate change and what NATO can do better to address this issue? After sharing their vision, we will be then able to easily flow into the discussion where we will be deeper elaborating on their messages and recommendations. This panel aims to be as interactive as possible with our audience, with you. Therefore, if you are watching right now, do not hesitate to write your questions on Slido for the question and answer session that will follow after discussion. There was also developed a really simple poll, which will navigate the panel in the real time. So jump on Slido right now and change the dynamic. The takeaway will be then wrapped up at the end of this panel. Let me introduce our four speakers. The first one is Tom Middendorp, who is a retired four-star general of the Royal Netherlands Army. He served as a chief of defense of the armed forces of the Netherlands between 2012 and 2017. Currently, he is the chair of the International Military Council of Climate and Security. He organized two large Future Forces conferences where he introduced an ecosystem approach to security and offered defense as a test bed for innovation resulting in many promising new initiatives. He also advises the Hague Center for Strategic Studies as a principal expert. The second one is Vice Admiral retired Ben Bekkering, who is former Netherlands military representative to NATO and EU. His career was around planned and executed humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations from the sea, both in command of ships and seagoing staffs, in East and West Africa and the Caribbean. His time around Somalia can be characterized by a decrease in number of piracy-related events and not one single successful attack by pirates. The third one is Elisa Say, who is working in Situational Awareness Integration Team of NATO's Situation Center at NATO headquarters in Brussels. Her expertise lies on climate change and security issues, as well as analyzing hybrid threats in the information space. She is part of NATO Young Staff Network, where she leads the Climate Change Hub. She's a research lead with a strong data analytics background who has worked on high-level analysis and reports for NATO's leadership on all geopolitical topics. Last but not least is Sofia Shevchuk, who is an independent researcher, analyst, and project manager in diplomacy, foreign policy, and security. She is particularly interested in climate diplomacy, climate security and resilience, climate justice, and feminist foreign policy. She has experience in working as a research assistant at the European Parliament, a researcher at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and an analyst and event manager at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So let me give a floor to our first speaker of this panel, being Elisa Say. So Elisa, what is the most crucial challenge that NATO faces in terms of climate change?
Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be part of this conference, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to this panel. So obviously, or as you very well elaborated already, undeniably, climate change has not only become a threat multiplier, but even more so, might become the main source for tensions in the global security environment in the coming decades. Some of you might have seen the recently published report from the US intelligence agencies, which highlights the competition over resources, which will increase whilst cooperation between countries will decrease, leading to more tensions globally. After 2030, the effects of climate change will exacerbate geopolitical flashpoints. And obviously, international organizations need to find a way to address this challenge and, more importantly, find ways to overcome it. So, Marie, your main question was for this panel, what would be the most challenging for NATO in terms of climate change, and how do we address this? Let me answer this in two parts. Firstly, I think when we talk about NATO as an actor in this field, I think it is always crucial to acknowledge the higher level of intergovernmental action that an organization based on consensus can achieve, which in NATO's case ultimately lies with the nations and their will to work together, agree on ambitious goals, but even more so, commit to them and stick to them. This is their challenge and task as an alliance. But secondly, for NATO as a place where people every day work so hard to assess problems, threats, and risks so the alliance can tackle them, here the challenge for me is to overcome the threat, this problem of breaking the threat of climate change down to a definition and a clear set of indicators that we can track, monitor, assess, and lastly, find adapt ways on how to address and overcome them. It's what we at NATO do so well with many other threats, be it conventional or hybrid. So this is, I think, the challenge for NATO. How do we define climate change as a threat that we can tackle? And obviously, it's such a vast topic. Where to start? What is relevant for NATO? And here, in my view, I would offer two lenses of assessments for NATO to tackle and play its part in overcoming the threats of climate change. The first lens is the direct impacts of climate change. How does climate change impact NATO and SACEUR's area of responsibility directly? We've seen heat waves and floods in North America and Europe, especially this year, and they seem to increase every year. And it shows that allies are not exempt from extreme weather events, many of which can directly be linked to the developments of climate change in the last century. The Arctic could see an ice-free summer before 2050. From a military perspective, it is important to highlight the logistical threat of climate change, the effects of which can damage military installations and critical infrastructure, hinder operational readiness and reinforcement, or create a need to divert capabilities and change economic and geopolitical calculations for the military. This is where we have to assess, monitor, and track the direct impact, which can cause civil emergencies in several NATO countries at the same time. And now coming to the second lens, which might become even more important for us to address as a threat multiplier, and this is the indirect impacts of climate change on security. The US report that I mentioned earlier highlighted how regions around the equator will suffer most, to the point that land will become uninhabitable. Last year, widespread rainfall in East Africa and abnormal dryness and drought in Southern Africa has, for example, led to an unprecedented threat to food security. And this, in turn, can lead to conflicts over territorial security, be it because of droughts or rising sea levels. Equally, climate change is already and will further fuel resource conflicts, which often lead to massive migration flows, which in turn allow human trafficking and sexual abuse to flourish. The moment is compounded by the current impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. These indirect factors also need to be defined for NATO, monitored, assessed, in order to be able to address them. So in conclusion, I think the biggest challenge for NATO lies within defining the problem of climate change as a security risk, to a point where we need to establish a set of indicators to measure the direct and indirect threat for NATO and allies. Don't get me wrong, I think that NATO should equally also play its role in reducing emissions and help mitigating and combating climate change as a whole. But if the question is what NATO can do, I think we should stick to what NATO was created for and is best at, keeping over 1 billion people safe. This is why I believe NATO must get ready to face the security challenges that will come with climate change by defining the risk in order to become resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I totally agree with you that what is relevant for NATO and what we have to track, define, monitor, and assess. So now I would like to ask for the vision and a message to our second speaker, who is Tom Middendorf. So Tom, what action should be taken into consideration to better tackle this long-term disconnect?
Well, thank you. And well, I completely agree with the previous speaker, so I hardly need to speak. But I would say these are the weeks of climate protest marches, of apocalyptic forecasts, of interest groups calling for action. Well, these are the weeks where the whole world is watching what's happening in Glasgow. And I was there last week. And I hope this will be a week of new actions, of next steps to take, and not just calling for actions. What COVID crisis showed us is that our world is globalized and interconnected, and that changes in one part of the world immediately impact on other parts of the world. So we cannot hide behind national boundaries, behind oceans, and behind sea dikes, like in my country. We live in a global village, and we're in this together, whether we like it or not, which means that we need to solve this together, despite all our differences. This is also the period of the tipping points, and the IPCC warned us that we are passing several tipping points, points of no return, like species being extincted or the polar cap melting away. We are facing an increasing gap between demand and supply. Our world population is expected to increase with another 50% this century to 11 billion people, all needing water, food, and all kinds of other materials. In the meantime, we are running short of those. So we are facing a period of increasing shortages of water, food, and all kinds of minerals, triggering all kinds of tensions. Very alarming. Now, the challenge for NATO on the short term is to mainstream climate change in their policies, to start a period of transformation. Climate change in the security community has long been neglected and underestimated. When I addressed this issue 4 years ago, when I was still the Chief of Defense, I was the first active serving general ever to address this. And it created a lot of fuss. It's the first time ever I went viral on the social media with a lot of political debates, and I even got a nickname, the Green General, a name which by the way, I wear with honor. And I see at this moment, I saw that the discussions about climate and security, about this nexus, were very polarized. There was a fear of securitizing the issue. But now that's changing, the tide is changing. We published our World Climate and Security Report in Munich, in the Munich Security Conference, and it triggered a lot of debate on the climate security nexus. And it's great to see the EU and NATO not only recognizing the nexus, but also starting to develop policies on it. And it's also great to see countries picking it up. And Eliza just referred to the 4 reports written by the US. These are not only reports from a defense angle, but also from the intelligence communities and also from Homeland Defense, which shows that there is an increasing demand for a more comprehensive effort in countering climate change. And I see more and more countries picking this up. But our challenge is, on the short term, is to make this movement wider, to widen the net, because there are still many, many countries, also within NATO, that don't give this a very high priority and that still need to be convinced of this nexus between climate and security. But it needs to be. We need to be part of a comprehensive effort. And we all know that, and we should start to recognize that, because climate change as said, acts as a kind of a risk multiplier in fragile regions. But not only that, it also changes geopolitical dynamics. It leads to increasing calls upon the military for disaster relief and humanitarian aid. It affects our vital infrastructures. And it requires defense organizations to predict, to mitigate, to adapt, and to cooperate. Now, what's the bigger challenge on the longer term? I think the longer term challenge is to mainstream that climate change into our policies and into our capacity building. And I think there are 4 areas where NATO can contribute to dealing with climate change. And the first one is forecasting. We have very, very powerful intelligence services all looking at these fragile regions. And these fragile regions are the regions hit hardest by climate change. Now, when we recognize climate change as a root of conflict, I think it makes sense for the intel services to address this in every estimate that they make. A second area would be on mitigation. The defense organizations are in any country, they emit more than half of all the emissions of the government. And they are often the largest single emitter in any country. So they have a responsibility to take when it comes to emission reductions. And I think we should see this as an opportunity. I think the new green technologies that are now developing in a very, very rapid way, leading to all kinds of transformations, for instance, in the automotive industries, I think they can help us to improve our self-sustainability. They can help us to deploy units that don't need big logistical supplies, but that can become more self-sustaining in their energy, in their water supply, and in the food supply. So I think we need to embrace these technologies, and I think defense can be a driver for innovation on this. A third area would be the area of new partnerships. As we all know, this is not a defense problem, but defense needs to be part of the solution, which means that we need to cooperate with NATO, with EU, but also cooperate with the fragile regions and fragile countries around us to help them become more resilient against climate change. And the last area I would like to mention is adaptation. We need to adapt geopolitically because our environment is changing. With the melting of the polar cap, for instance, a new geopolitical arena opens up. We need to adapt more operationally in the missions that we do, become more climate sensitive, and we need to adapt in our facilities and our capabilities. For instance, by protecting our harbors and our coastal facilities against the impacts of climate change. So all of this requires us to mainstream it into our policies and the capability developments. Thank you.
Tom. Thank you also for addressing COP26 at Glasgow, because I think this is really relevant to today's panel, and also mentioning social media, because I think it's really impressive what you said, that you went viral 4 years ago. So I think that also social media are quite changing the dynamic of how people can know about the climate change and what is happening, and also it helps science a lot. So I would like now to ask our third speaker, being Sofia Shevchuk. So in your view, what is the most challenging for NATO in terms of climate?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here. It's a great honor and pleasure to talk to all of you. And surprisingly enough, I'm going to agree a lot with what previous speakers have said, but I will try to add upon coming from my perspective and my area of expertise, which being gender, climate, and security. I would also love to start from the COP26 and mentioning that it's not only the very good moment right now that we are talking about this during the time when the protests are happening and the negotiations are taking place in Glasgow, but it's also the first COP when climate security has actually been discussed. Surprisingly enough, it has not been discussed at previous COPs. And it's the first COP which hosted the NATO Secretary General, which I think is quite a good development and shows the importance of climate change and the role NATO plays in it. So looking at what NATO already has committed itself to, has been the biggest focus has been around the greenhouse gas emissions, around trying to transition to more biofuels, solar panels, creating the action plan for the NATO member states and allies. So I think that NATO already understands what climate change is and that it's actually happening and that NATO can have a contribution there. However, there are some limitations as to NATO's vision, which I will try to address right now in my speech and try to focus on 3 areas. So the first one would be trying to reconsider what security actually is and in the new climate disrupted world, and try to re-equip accordingly. And as previous speakers already were mentioning, it's basically about trying to mainstream climate throughout all the policies, throughout the capacity planning, throughout the operational strategic visions, but also throughout the staff recruitment, trying to basically not having a climate as a separate issue on the NATO board, or trying to create, as there were already discussions of creation of the Center of Excellence in Canada on climate security. So there should be ensured that those things are not discussed separately, but are discussed all together from within and trying to be included in whatever type of discussion is happening at NATO. Second one would be moving beyond the reactive posture towards climate security, towards more preventive actions. The fact that we are still talking here, it means that there are still things that we can do in order to prevent climate change effects from being that drastic as they could have been. And NATO has a crucial role to play here. So far, the responses have been mostly focused on preparedness efforts and adaptation mitigation, which is, don't take me wrong, very important. And I think we have to start talking about them right now. However, we still can do something in order to preempt and to ensure some management actions that can be taken to prevent the climate change effects from being that harsh as they could have been. And the role NATO could play here is potentially trying to adapt a natural engineering within its array of activities, meaning that NATO can become a vessel for climate adaptation mitigation in order to ensure that the food security, water security, which Tom has been mentioning before, is not going to have that drastic effects as it could. And in order for all of this to happen, of course, NATO, due to its unique nature, cannot do it alone. And therefore, I would love to also point out towards the cooperation issue and trying to ensure, which NATO has already been doing for a long time, trying to cooperate with other international organizations such as the European Union, the United Nations, the OSCE. I would also try to maybe put a bomb out there and try to mention the cooperation with China and Russia. The second one probably being a bit more problematic, but cooperation with China would be significant in order to ensure that the climate change response is time-wise effective and brought there altogether, which I understand is not the easiest one, but I think the discussions would have to start right now. And then also about the inclusion of women and young people. So there has been already the participation of youth in the 2030 thinking process of NATO. Women, peace and security agenda has been high at the priorities level for NATO, but they should also be part of the climate security discussion. And I'm happy that we have at the panel Elisa, who is one of those leading the discussions from NATO within, and we should have more people like those being engaged in the whole process. And I would love to conclude with my key message, which has also been shortly touched upon Tom before. It's about the whole militarization of climate change. I think we should try to avoid this from happening because climate change is a very sensitive issue, and we know that at the core of the whole problem, there are a lot of vulnerable people. And if we try to militarize the response, there might be more crisis happening out of that, more threats appearing. Therefore, we need to try to climatize the security policies rather than try to securitize and militarize the climate action, which I think has also been one of the key messages that the NATO 2030 young leaders were trying to bring with their reports. Thank you very much for the attention.
So much for mentioning 2030, NATO 2030, because this is also why kind of we are here as Atlantic Forum, providing a platform for young people. And this is also why we are now discussing the climate change. And I totally agree with you that, for example, Russia and China are posing a really serious challenge to NATO, and that there should be the mutual relation of the climate change, and that we should play more together and speak about it together. And last but not least, I would like to ask Ben what NATO can do better to address this issue.
I think, first of all, thank you very much. And what a fantastic seminar this is. And thank you for allowing me to contribute. NATO can do an awful lot of things. But I think the first thing to recognize is that NATO also does face considerable challenges. And that's and I throw in the elephant in the room. I think solidarity and unity, which is always the issue in NATO, will play an important role in this discussion as well. Let me try to explain. To me, climate change is the single most important driver of instability and insecurity. Whether it's droughts or floods or storms or heat waves, whether you live in moderate Arctic or tropical climates, whether it's urban or rural, whether it's in river catchments or on the river deltas, everybody and everywhere we will be affected by climate change, with the direct result of poverty, famine, suffering, migration, crime, terrorism, regional conflicts, and perhaps even also flaring up global strategic competition. So whether we like it or not, it is a big security issue. And even if we could solve the climate change or revert the climate change to better conditions, still there will be lots of security issues remaining. Think, for instance, about those nations who will lose a lot of oil revenues and become desperate to seek for other ways. Or see those nations who see an opportunity in an energy transition and start a whole chase for rare earth materials. And I've recently read an article about the Congo. You don't want to live in the Congo at the moment. It's complete chaos. So there's lots of security issues, even if we are embarking on the energy transition. What I would say is what we need as a world is a rules-based international order. Now that's there, but it's contested by many actors, state actors and non-state actors. And even I think the keepers of the rules-based international order, let me say the West, US, Europe, we're not so aligned as well together. So who is now making sure that we have a rules-based international order that can act as some sort of a referee in what we need to do to tackle the climate change? Now, NATO has always been a staunch partner obviously can and have to do things. Allow me to make three perhaps somewhat critical observations and then give you a few considerations that I would like to hand over. There's a golden rule in my profession and that of Tom's, is that when you've been relieved and retire, you are relieved of the watch and somebody else is the watch. So it's not my position to then tell people what they should do, but I give you some considerations. First, some critical observations. NATO, and I think Elisa mentioned that as well, is a sum of 30 sovereign nations. And at the moment, I think they certainly are not always aligned on important issues, and climate change is one of them. So hence, solidarity and unity will become crucially important. NATO always is also a military alliance. And requires a solution, and I think Sophia and also Tom mentioned it. But it goes even beyond a whole of government approach. It requires a whole of society approach. Everybody needs to dip in. And here comes the third observation I have, critical observation. NATO is perhaps not the most respected, well-seen, well-invited guest in a whole of society environment. Not always are we seen as a partner in many crises around the world. That is something that NATO has to take into consideration. Now, in order to maintain relevance, NATO must act, and a lot of examples have already been named, and I I think my observations are very much, my considerations are very much in line with it. First of all, I think what NATO can do is direct the intelligence communities, which come together in a NATO-wide picture, to focus on the causes and the effects of climate change. My belief is that if you understand climate change, if you understand the effects that are coming, you can somehow, somewhere predict the effects and take relevant and timely action. This is something that is very important to do from now. The second thing I would like to say is that NATO has an unrivaled and very tested planning capability to work out contingency plans. Let's do that, and let's work out contingency plans for all those areas, all those regions, but also all those events that we think may happen. Third, I think NATO now needs to truly invest in operational level partnerships. Who will we meet in all those areas where we need to act to maintain stability and restore security? And can we already in our planning phase work with them alongside? And that includes organizations like NGOs who will find some reluctance in working together with NATO, but we must approach them. Third, use NATO's equally well-developed standardization and planning processes, defense planning processes, to stimulate a true green revolution in military affairs. It's not only good to keep ourselves resilient, but also it will, I'm sure, increase our operational effect once we achieve that. And if we become the leaders in that, it will benefit us significantly. Not only are the military a huge polluter and user of fossil fuel, we're also, the military in total, are big investors. We spend a lot of money on a yearly base, so let's spend that money wisely. And last but not least, I would argue that let's focus on not so much on the large-scale wars, but let's focus on a flexible mix of crisis response with a combination of presence in those areas that are likely to be affected, humanitarian assistance, training and advice, also training in a green way of doing our business, and use the deterrence. Use for deterrence are tripwires and standoff weaponry. That's a whole wide range of things that NATO can do. And I listened into the ASG van Weel earlier on. A lot of things are already in progress, and that's good to see. But I think we need to step up. I think NATO is well placed as an organization to become a leader in many of those fields. But we need, and that's the internal threat, we need to overcome certainly the diverging opinions within the nations. If we can manage that, NATO can retain its relevancy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And thank you for mentioning, for example, that the climate change is driven by insecurity, and all of us is kind of attached to this change and to this paradigm that has to be tackled. And now I would like to move to the discussion, because all of you mentioned really nice points and what NATO should or shouldn't do, and how we can tackle the climate change together. Which leads me that all of you quite mention togetherness, that how also the NATO is working. It's because there are 30 allies which should work together and tackle this issue, where actually it's quite beyond the NATO, because all the globe is included in the climate change. And my question would be, so even though there are 30 allies, it seems to me that there is quite polarization in with the policy making and in how states are actually acting towards the climate change. Some of the states are leaders, some of states are followers, and some see it in a totally different way. So can you probably elaborate on this polarization, and how can we actually enhance that we can actually be together in this combat against the climate change? So I don't know who of you would like to take floor to elaborate on this. Yeah. Maybe, Ben, that you were speaking the last one.
Yeah, no, and I think and I mentioned that we have to stick together. We have to find partnerships because it's all about the whole society approach. But within that, I would argue that NATO must stick to its origins, and I think if NATO is able to predict, preempt, perhaps even reactively to all that may erupt, using the military instrument of power well embedded in a much wider integrated approach, then NATO can be successful. So don't start to and that's perhaps a bit of the militarization of the climate discussion. Don't do that, but in the first place, and make sure you become a leader in that field. That is what I would say. So define your own role and don't overplay your hand.
Yes, Elisa.
Yes, I just wanted to quickly come back on what Ben has just said, because it's a very, very crucial point, I think, when we talk about the question of how to bring allies together and basically have the same interest in this topic. Ben, you mentioned it's about what is NATO's core business, and NATO's core business is not to obviously solve the climate change or like the crisis. It's rather basically it's twofold. So on the one hand, of course, we are a player, an international player that is, as any other international organization, part of this challenge and of this responsibility to respond and help and mitigating climate change, play our part. And we know all that the military is a huge emission source. So yes, that is a role, but it is very important, I think, that we make clear to allies that there's a very integral self-interest for them in their role to address climate change in terms of security issues. So if we manage to get the narrative right to some of the nations who are just not convinced of why should NATO do something as well, and they do have a point. They do definitely have a point in terms of course, NATO cannot address all problems of the world because we only have a very bespoke mandate, and that's also a very important mandate. So we need to basically invoke the self-interest of nations to be like, oh, if we actually don't do anything about climate change, then the problem will come back to exactly NATO's mandate in terms of we won't be able to keep our people safe. So that's, I think, something which really needs to be distinct, that yes, NATO is one part of mitigation and like everyone else has to play its part, but NATO also needs to really be able to shape out and carve out its very unique role that it can play in actually addressing the climate change security risks. And if we make that clear to nations that they themselves should be interested in NATO getting involved in climate change security threats, then we have a better consensus than just trying to get them all on board to reduce emissions because it's our duty. So that's just an idea that I wanted to quickly bring to it.
Thank you to stressing up that reducing emission is our duty. I really like this sentence. So I would like to ask Tom if he has some other comment to the togetherness.
Yeah, what I've witnessed the last few years, that's very hard to get people on board on this, to recognize this climate security nexus. But I also see that once you start these debates and once you start explaining them why these are connected, they start recognizing it. And it's very important so to invest in awareness, not just to make new policies, but to trigger these debates within NATO and to invest in awareness. So if we could ask the intelligence communities to develop new assessments on the impacts of climate change, I think that would be a great message for countries to make it more relevant for them. I think it's also important to make clear to those countries that it does not replace current threats. Many countries are very concerned that this is a kind of a new topic that will get a new priority at the cost of other threats. That's not the case. Climate change is an integral part of all the threats that we face, and it's a threat multiplier of all the threats that we are already facing. So it helps us to put more emphasis on those threats. So we shouldn't see it as a threat in itself to do this debate. And the last thing I would like to say in this discussion, what we can also use is that we can see it as an opportunity when it comes to improving our operational effectiveness. By building our own self-sustainability, we can improve the operational effectiveness of all our capabilities. If we can build ships that don't have to bunker in every harbor that they run into, but have more endurance because they use new green technologies, then that has an operational benefit. If we can build bases that are self-sustaining, we don't need these big and very expensive logistic supplies, then that has an operational benefit. So I think we should also look at the positive side of this and try to communicate that. And last but not least, it's very important to show leadership. So we have some very good and leading countries now also leading efforts on climate and security. So let's put this on the agenda. Let's put their views on the agenda and trigger a positive debate.
Thank you so much to bring a bit positivity into this discussion. It's really important, and I totally agree that everything is about communication. We should not take someone behind us. We should be there together. And now I would like to give a floor to Sophia. Sophia, what do you think about togetherness?
I'll just try to add maybe 5 cents to everything what has been already mentioned, and trying to point out to the fact that NATO can be used sort of as a platform for those countries to debate and talk to each other. And trying to take an example, the famous debate, the 2% debate, which has been there for ages and which has already been a negative type of connotation, but trying to push and make it more a positive one and trying to use it as an enhance towards those allies which potentially might not yet fully agree even on the emissions reductions, which is the basics as we have already discussed here, and trying to enhance those and, I don't know, shift the discussion of 2% towards making it more, in a way, if you do reduce the emissions and the greenhouse emissions, then the 2% target is going to be reached faster, or try to sort of use this carrot stick type of argument in a more carrot way rather than the stick one. But that might be one of the options from my side.
Yes, I would also like to stress that COP26 was kind of debate which was, I would say, even mainstream around the world, that a lot of people and policymakers were watching it. So I think this is kind of way how we can bring more togetherness into the climate change, and how can we be together, because it doesn't mean that if one country has one opinion, there is always contra-argument somewhere else, and we should speak about it. I would like to go to the first speaker when we were touching upon the togetherness, and Ben, you mentioned that their militarization of climate discussion, that we should kind of avoid it. But when we are speaking about NATO, and NATO is a military organization, how can we actually avoid that? How can we avoid that the climate change will not be part of the militarization? Because when there are droughts, floods, etc., it means that immigration is happening, and then NATO has to come to the place. And we can also speak about the potential conflicts in the future when it comes to the climate change. So what do you think about the militarization of the climate change, and how can we avoid it, if there is any way, actually?
Yeah, Paul, how can we avoid it? I would honestly say that when I follow the debate in the newspapers and in the media, I think a lot of people that are involved in climate change, and don't get me wrong, but I often see that the discussion is very much caught between the tree huggers and the deniers, and there's little in between. Whereas I honestly feel that the solutions should always be in the middle. The solutions can never be found in the extreme. So I would say, let's avoid a discussion whether militarizing the climate or climatizing the military, but that there are serious security issues, and they will be accelerated by climate change. And I think step one is for the combined military, and then NATO is a very strong alliance in that. And that's the point that Tom made as well. Advocate what you see happening in the world and what you see is a serious security risk. and then explain what it is that the military can do to create conditions for others to do their job. And I think when you look at humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, if we are present in areas where we see it happening, and I know that the Netherlands, France, and UK have set up an organization in the Caribbean, so when hurricanes hit, we are prepared, we are going there together. If you are present somewhere, if you have the ability to move in, then move in as a sort of a first responder. Make sure that you establish a situation for others then to come in, and then the military could in fact step back. And I think in many crises you could see a same pattern, that military can create conditions for others to do their job, and I would very much promote that.
Thank you. Someone would like to interact when it comes to the militarization of climate change from other speakers? Yes, Tom?
No, I fully agree with what Ben said, and I think it's important that we don't see this as a military problem demanding a military solution. We should see this as a responsibility to be part of a wider team, to be part of a comprehensive effort with all kinds of other players. And these other players is not just the EU, it's also the fragile countries, it's also the businesses in the world with whom we can develop new technologies on the green area. It's also about developing new civil cooperation mechanisms in dealing with disaster relief and dealing with humanitarian crisis. It's also about building partnerships with these fragile regions and fragile countries. So by doing that, by approaching it in this way, I think we can avoid this picturing of we militarizing and hijacking the subject of climate change, which is absolutely not the case. And also in our communications, we need to be very sensitive about this and avoid the wrong words being used. And last but not least, I think we can, as I said before, we can be a very big driver of innovation. If we develop next generation naval vessels or next generation heavy vehicles with green technologies, these are all dual use technologies. So together with civil companies, we can help develop those kind of technologies which can be used very widely in the civil arena. So we can help them adapt and help them mitigate the climate change.
Yes, Elisa? You're muted, Elisa.
Oh, sorry, rookie error. I just wanted to come back on 2 points that Ben and Tom has said, but actually I found what Sophia has said before in terms of rather turning it around, not militarization of climate change, but climatization of security issues, is a very, very good point, because I don't think it's necessarily about militarization the problem. I think there will be no option for the military not to deal with the problems of climate change. And Ben and Tom, you've pointed it very well out how this will impact civil emergency disaster response mechanisms. So I think we've seen it also now with the pandemic for the first time, or not for the first time, but there was all of a sudden a very big need for the military to become involved in this pandemic crisis that was normally none of NATO's or military's mandate, but all of a sudden the military becomes again this framework in a society that is there to help citizens, that is there to make sure that actually lives are secured and that we as an alliance can live safely. So I think that's one point, that there will be that there will be no scenario where we can avoid that military and climate change have to basically find a way to align themselves with their mandate. I think one other point I have is what what Ben said before on contingency plans. That's one issue which I find very, very important in terms of how do we actually adapt, or how do we actually plan to adapt to the scenarios of climate change, let's say in 20 years in an operational perspective. And that's where I find the discussion within NATO either between allies or also within the organization itself, very interesting, because there's a big misunderstanding sometimes that people who say, hey, we need to do smart or green defense, we need to be able to actually both adapt military equipment to climate change, but also make it greener. I think there sometimes is this make it greener in the forefront of people's minds, and then a lot of, I'm sure Tom and Ben, you have a lot of military colleagues who then panic because the tank might not run on hybrid energy, and that's obviously not the point at all. There's so much need for us to actually rethink how will our airplanes, our military equipment actually work in an environment that is plus maybe if we are super optimistic, that is plus 1.5 degree. And so, but there are many other scenarios, especially for the areas where NATO does have operational interests, where the conditions will change significantly. So maybe half of the equipment that we currently use won't even be able to be operational anymore. So when we talk about how do we basically do contingency planning, how do we maybe adapt our military equipment to climate change, we need to look at it from both perspectives. They need to adapt because they might not be able to use them anymore, but they also, within this dual technology or dual use logic, they also might become much smarter by actually upgrading them to a emissions efficient way. And that's, I think, a very, very important point in a discussion, especially with military or with security-related professionals.
Thank you. I like that you touch upon the green defense, because actually I wanted to ask you about the green technology and green defense as your expertise in hybrid threats. So you nicely cover it two in one. And please, Sophia.
Thank you. I would just I agree with all the points that have been mentioned before, but I would love to bring the debate also a bit to the core of the human security and remembering who are the people that are suffering the most and who are the ones who are greatly affected by the climate change. So I think when I was mentioning trying to avoid the securitization and militarization, it was sort of trying to remember that those are the people there and that we are responsible in front of them. And by trying, what not to do is sort of trying to avoid the militarizing the national borders in a way that they would affect and make the conditions of those vulnerable people even worse for them. But I do agree with all the proposals that have been mentioned already before.
Thank you very much. And I have to also announce you that we have so many questions from the audience, actually. So let's jump into them. And the first question is, how are NATO's climate efforts synchronizing with the EU and other international organizations' efforts in this field? So as we may know that there is some NATO agenda, but as now we are living in globalization and there are so many other international organizations. So how can we actually synchronize all of this agenda, and how can we keep with some kind of navigation? Who would like to elaborate on this question first? Maybe I will ask you, Sophia.
Sure. I haven't been following that much on the cooperation between the EU and NATO recently, but I have been doing this for the past, before the whole COVID-19 started. So I would say that there is already quite a good ground for cooperation at the staff level, at the higher level between EU, NATO, between OSCE and NATO, UN and NATO. So the channels are already there. But from what I'm aware of, I'm not sure that climate change has been taken a good and relevant part in those type of discussions. So it's probably somewhere there mentioned at the background, but it's truly not the core of the discussions. So my response would basically be the channels are there. There are ways already. So people already do talk to each other, which I think is already quite a huge step forward. But bringing climate change and trying to be a bit more collaborative on that, especially maybe right now while EU is trying to develop its own policies on how they want to bring climate change into its foreign and security policy, as well as NATO is only at doing the first baby step. So I think trying to avoid the previous mistakes when we try to, towards the end, think, oh, there are also others doing the job, but maybe try to bring it at the core in the beginning of the whole policy development and try to start talking to each other right now. So that would be my.
Thank you. I also agree that lessons learned are really important. And please, Ben, what do you have to tell about the international organizations?
Yeah, I honestly believe that cooperation between NATO and the EU is stronger and getting stronger. There's lots of effort from both organizations to do that. And let's not forget that I'm losing count a bit, but 21 or 22 countries of both organizations are the same. So it would be odd if they would express an opinion that is different from what they do on the other side of town. What I find from own experience a bit difficult in the EU is that all security-related issues are part of the intergovernmental part, whereas all other areas are in the communautaire part, so the common decision-making. And here we see, and we see the same thing with cyber, for instance, but we see an area, climate change, that overlaps both the security and all other aspects of life. And the EU is split organizationally in those two. And I think that will be a major hurdle for the EU to take. That's perhaps outside the debate, but it is one thing to take into consideration.
Yes, that's very true. So, Tom, please.
Yeah, I think Ben and Eliza know more about the EU-NATO interaction, so I leave that to them. But I also want to point out the value of international conferences like this one we're in now. Because here you can have an open exchange of all kinds of insights and thoughts, and thereby stimulating policy development and feeding into policy development on all sides in all organizations. So I think these and I've witnessed that during the last few years, that these conferences are quite are like a think tank. You develop all kinds of ideas, and there are policymakers listening in, and they pick them up and they translate that into their policies. And I think these are also good platforms, like we are doing in our IMCCS organization, to exchange best practices between countries that overarch the boundaries of organizations like NATO and EU. We have a global network which enables us to also look at climate change from completely other angles, from other regions, and have completely other best practices on the table that we can use. So this interaction, I think, helps very much to synchronize efforts. Thank you.
Yes, I totally agree that as we also may see it with the globalization and with all of these international organizations, and somehow they are connected to each other. So like we can speak also about global civilization, where all of the agendas should go with each other alongside and no against. And last but not least, Eliza, please.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick note. I think obviously when we talk about synchronization or alignment of what the EU and NATO is doing, there's a big difference in what the EU is doing and can do and should do to combat climate change. And what we've now discussed in length is what is NATO's bespoke mandate and role with regards to climate change and security. So I think when we look at those two different roles, it should be the sweet spot of where are both organizations very, very important, and where do both have strengths and interest to work together. And in my opinion, that's mostly on the crisis response. So we've seen it with COVID. There was great cooperation, sometimes first time cooperation between many international organizations. And I think this should, if we look at climate change and what we've now talked about, the challenge of human security in the future, how can NATO leverage its super well equipped toolbox of crisis response and maybe train together with the EU, do exercises together with the EU, basically find the sweet spot of EU and NATO in terms of how do we align our efforts on combating climate change. And I think that will be in crisis response and civil emergencies.
Thank you. And Ben, do you have something to say, or it was you raised the hand?
No, I agree with Elisa, but that is exactly, I think, where some of the problems are, I think, in the EU. And let's not forget that the EU has many more policy instruments available that NATO has. But when you mention crisis response, as a military representative, I was invited once by DG ECHO, which is on the Commission side, to come and witness their ability. And I was almost forbidden because as a military representative to the EU, I'm in the intergovernmental part and not allowed to speak with the other side of the EU, which is a bit difficult to comprehend. I did go, by the way, but so when it comes to crisis response, NATO finds itself aligned with an organization within the EU, which is not their traditional speaking partner, so to say. So there are also organizational hurdles that we need to take. Nevertheless, I think there is already a lot of good cooperation in the way, and we should move that up, I think.
Yes, I totally agree. And there is another really nice question from our audience. And this question would go mainly to Tom and also Ben, because the last week I was part of the masterclass, which was organized exclusively for our patrons as well. And this question is navigating us to the Arctic operations. So how does the NATO climate plan translate into NATO Arctic operations? Please, Tom. Maybe you can start on the elaboration of this question.
Yes, well, of course, until now, the Arctic has not been a very big topic in NATO, also because there are separate mechanisms for the Arctic. There's a separate forum and a separate negotiation platform for dealing with the Arctic. But at the same time, we do have to recognize the enormous change that is happening there. As I said before, there is a completely new geopolitical arena opening up. There are big countries planting flags on the bottom of the ocean to claim resources, countries like Russia, China, but also Western countries like the US and several Scandinavian countries. So this is a source of friction in the future. And another change that it will bring is that it opens up completely new lines of communication over the north, new trading routes with China. And that also will lead to kind of a shifting balance of power in the world. So on a more strategic level, NATO needs to consider, okay, what is the impact of this change and how do we need to adapt to that? So there is a very big geopolitical dimension to climate change that affects the position of NATO, maybe even the disposition of NATO and its efforts. But it certainly demands more policy development with regard to the Arctic, and maybe even will lead to a repositioning of NATO assets to deal with it.
Yes, thank you. I really liked the elaboration of geopolitical dynamic. And as Elisa also has kind of expertise in geopolitics, maybe you can elaborate a bit on this topic as well.
Yes, I think what is very interesting with the Arctic especially is, and I'm sure Ben and Tom know much more about this from a military perspective, but obviously the topic of Russia, Sophia has touched upon it before, is very different from what NATO would consider in terms of how climate change is impacting the security and basically has to be wants to be part of this fight against climate change. For Russia, the strategic calculus is very different because if the Arctic is ice-free, that's amazing because it opens up more sea routes that give Russia much more leverage over actually controlling trade routes, obviously also establishing new military routes, being able to do entirely different strategic calculations on how quickly deployments can be made. So, and we must almost say, even though Russia has luckily turned around in the last years and is now also committed to fighting climate change, for a long time for Putin, climate change was almost a present for Russia because a lot of the rising temperatures, especially in the east of Russia, is going to make land more habitable, more will be better for farming. Obviously, there's a lot of downsides. So luckily, yes, Russia has now also seen that it's not the winner of climate change, but unfortunately, it will have a very, very big impact on how NATO or how NATO allies will be able to negotiate with Russia and also China on this Arctic issue, because unfortunately for China and Russia, having an ice-free Arctic is not the worst thing that they can think of in terms of geopolitical calculations. And I think that's going to be a very, very tricky and a very, very sensitive issue to negotiate and navigate for NATO allies, because it's very obvious what will be problems that NATO then has to face. So I find it a very interesting perspective, and I would like to see what Ben says in terms of what's the military way out of this dilemma of basically telling Russia that it's not good for them that the Arctic is ice free.
Yes, please, Tom.
Yeah, I think, for more than one reason, this is very interesting, and I would say that probably this is the one of the better arguments, if you already need one, to really start to decrease or basically nullify our reliance on fossil fuel, because not only does the thawing permafrost allow Russia to produce much more grain, and they're already using the grain as a strategic tool, but it also opens up extra possibilities for exploration of oil and gas. So if we don't need oil and gas anymore, then that problem is off the table. Now, Russia has a lot of other vested interest in that region, but I would say anywhere in the world you go and you find clashes over borders, most of them are maritime borders, whether it's the Eastern Mediterranean or the South China Sea or the Arctic, and most of it's about resources, and most of that is oil and gas resources. So if you need an argument extra to nullify your need of oil and gas, then here you have it.
Yes, Elisa, you wanted to come back to something.
Yes, thank you. I found that a very interesting point, because I'm completely with you, and that's obviously the most logic conclusion. However, I also think it's very interesting how this autumn we've seen how quickly nations are already then outpaced a bit by the developments of the energy market. So we've seen a huge energy crisis, which for allies has resulted mostly in a electricity crisis and in a price crisis. So it wasn't about scarcity of gas; it was just about distribution and also miscalculation. So all of a sudden, due to the pandemic, people had to heat more their homes. They used more electricity. At the same time, the weather didn't play into the cards of renewable energies. There was less wind, hence much lesser renewable energies. And all of a sudden, this great plan of, we're going to do renewable energy transition. It's going to be great. The EU is now like plowing forward and with the green plan, the Green Deal. And all of a sudden, it's Russia who is the savior of the time, because Nord Stream 2 can be quickly opened to help the Europeans out of this pickle, which they have put themselves in by miscalculating the energy needs and by also not facing the very uncomfortable truth of what energy transition will mean, because there will be, in the short term, there will be probably an increase of gas resources needed and oil resources needed. And I think the challenge here will be how to communicate this to the public, because it's one side to say, Green Deal, and yes, the pandemic has shown us we now need to definitely fight climate change, but then still have projects like Nord Stream 2. And I'm not saying I'm not even sometimes convinced it's just a bad project. It's in many instances, obviously, a very geopolitical tool as well that has very many other factors except for energy resources to be factored in. But I think this will be the key challenge for policymakers in the coming 10 years at least, to on the one hand say, yes, we need to get away from traditional energy resources, but until we have enough of the other stuff that we actually then want to go to. So it's going to be a very tricky route in terms of strategic communications, I think.
Yes, I totally agree. And thank you for this brainstorming discussion and answering the questions of our audience. Unfortunately, the time is running really fast. I feel like I would be here with you even for one more hour, because we get so many other interesting questions that can be also addressed. But maybe in our spring conference the next year, we can again assemble together on the topic of the climate change. So just to briefly wrap up, I think that the NATO is doing a good job when it comes to the togetherness, because we are stronger together. And all of you had really interesting visions and recommendations what it comes to NATO and the climate change as such. Even though all of you coming from the different backgrounds, you were kind of elaborating on this question which I posed to you in different sense, but I think that all of you had kind of consensus in that all of the nations should come together and have a debate, have a conversation, because climate change is posing the geopolitical insecurity to all of us, not only to international organizations, but also to people around the globe. So I would like to thank you to all of you, all of the four speakers which came today to tackle the issue of the climate change, and also of the Atlantic Forum that provided platform for us, for the young professionals and for the experts to come together and to exchange their opinions, and also to Petra, our chair of the conference and a project management team. So thank you for this experience. I don't know if you have something really briefly to take on. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You win again, extraterrestrial beast. Games are just a fun way to waste time, right? Not necessarily. Playing games could lead to new ways to combat modern threats. That's what we're looking at today in NATO Science. Around the world, people spend billions of hours a week playing games. But what if, rather than playing games aimlessly, we could divert this time and effort into solving security problems? Our scientist in Ankara has more.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us for Atlantic Forum's final panel of the Autumn Conference. I hope that those of you who have dropped into our other panels over the past 2 days have found what you heard insightful and thought-provoking, which I hope we can build on here. My name is Kellen McCullum. I'm a program manager for Atlantic Forum and will be moderating today's panel entitled "The Cards Were Dealt: Proofing NATO for the Externalities and Non-Traditional Adversaries of Tomorrow." Until now, this conference has covered the breadth of discontinuities facing NATO and put under a spotlight various issues the alliance will have to reckon with in a new geopolitical landscape. Now, we're putting politics in focus, both at the institutional level, NATO, and within individual member states that have endured crises which have stress-tested political systems with mixed results. So here's what we are exploring today with our panelists. Is NATO as an institution prepared for the challenges and discontinuities that lie ahead? Where do we come up short politically? From a policy standpoint, to what extent is there a gap, if there is one, between the threat orientation of the alliance and the contingencies that lie ahead? Are national political institutions within the alliance unprepared? And how have past crises affected other supranational institutions, such as the EU, demonstrated that intra-alliance unity is not guaranteed? We will also take a look at who our adversaries are, both state and non-state actors, and what hybrid threats they present to our politics and national institutions. Can the alliance be eroded from within? What safeguards are in place, or what additional ones are needed? To explore these and other issues, as well as to tease out solutions and actionable measures member states should be taking to proof themselves and NATO from external attempts to sow doubt and distrust, we've brought together 3 young professionals hailing from different backgrounds with a variety of experiences, yet all with a shared interest in seeing the healthy evolution and durability of the alliance. Our first panelist, Anka Agaki, is an associate director for the Transatlantic Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Her work on TSI focuses on transatlantic security, conflict and stabilization, emerging threats, and foresight. Anka is driven by a desire to understand the long-term transformation of conflict, and her experience and interests are at the intersection of security policy and development. Previously, she worked for the EU's European Defence Agency on defense capability development projects in the information security and space domains, and served as United Nations Youth Representative for Romania, focusing extensively on the UN 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals. Anka is a Security and Defense Fellow with Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. She holds a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, with a concentration in international security policy and a double specialization in conflict resolution in Africa. She holds a Bachelor in International Relations and European Studies from the University of Bucharest, as well as a BA in International Business and Economics from the Bucharest Academy of Economic Studies. Anka is originally from Bucharest, Romania. Anka, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kellen, for the very extensive bio, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I'm really excited to be here with you all. And I guess maybe just to briefly set up the conversation on my end, as you heard, what I'm interested in is not only where we are at today, but also where the Alliance is headed in the future. That's the bread and butter of what I spend my days working on. And so with that in mind, I think the only thing I will say to set up the conversation is that NATO, I think, is in many ways at a crossroads where we are at, and as we head towards a new strategic concept. I think in many ways we have a difficult strategic landscape which sees the return of great power rivalry, as we've seen, and NATO snapping back into kind of a traditional defense and deterrence role, but at the same time a host of other non-traditional challenges that will require new capabilities, new institutional changes, and new formats of collaboration. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to dig into that with all of you today and see what are the external threats, what are the internal threats, and how NATO can be better in dealing with all of them.
Great, and we are equally excited to have you on board. Our next panelist, Andrew Erskine. Andrew is a research analyst at the NATO Association of Canada and is an analyst director for the NATO Research Group, where he leads a case study on regional security in Southeast Asia. He is also a political analyst for the New Global Order, a think tank based in Rome, Italy, and a researcher for the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers based out of Ayr University. Andrew holds a master's degree in global affairs from the University of Prince Edward Island, Canada, and his work focuses on great power competition, the Indo-Pacific, and Canadian foreign policy. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Kellen, for the introduction. It was greatly appreciated. I'm extremely thankful for the opportunity of being a panelist and partaking in discussions with my fellow panelists with the Atlantic Forum's Autumn Conference. I would like to reinforce, first and foremost, that the views or opinions expressed during this panel represent my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the NATO Association of Canada, the NATO Research Group, the New Global Order, or the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. The topic of identifying threats from externalities and non-traditional adversaries is something that needs more attention, in my opinion, from the strategic and policy circles of NATO and its members. NATO is an alliance that has been around for the past 72 years, and it has firsthand experiences with operating within great power rivalries, state-centric conflicts, peacekeeping, and anti-terrorist operations, along with assisting in environmental and pandemic responses. But with the post-World War II international rules-based order moving towards a deepening multipolar structure, and with the geopolitical and economic centers of gravity turning towards the Asian continent, NATO needs to reinforce its perspective of being a pillar for obviously transatlantic defense and deterrence, with its leadership role in guiding and preserving a rules-based international order. With these two principles emerging, NATO is currently undergoing and will continue to go and encounter security and defense challenges that will test the alliance's military, political, and institutional unity, cohesion, and effectiveness. In particular, Today, I hope to argue and have an insightful discussion about NATO's current dilemma in undergoing inter-alliance problems with developing a collective Indo-Pacific engagement strategy, along with anticipating the growing challenges posed by China's great power rise and how this will impact the alliance's security and defense mandate for its regional responsibility.
Great. Welcome, Andrew. Glad to have you. Our third and last panelist, but certainly not least, is Guillaume Lauwers. Guillaume graduated this year from the Free University of Brussels with a Bachelor of Political Science, specializing in international relations. He completed a Master of Political Science, focusing on European and international governance. He has written on policy issues that overlap with challenges facing NATO, such as the increasing accessibility of the Arctic Circle. He has taken part in various conferences under the Model United Nations umbrella across Europe and continues to be captivated by the range of threats, seen and unseen, that could stress test the alliance. Guillaume currently works for Soiten International, a Belgian-based agency involved in organizing national and international congresses, meetings, and events. Guillaume, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kellen. Thank you for having me on this panel. Thank you, Atlantic Forum, for hosting this conference. Indeed, I've heard from the two previous panelists a broad range of issues that we need to discuss. And I like to have a broad view of things. And I think, as Anka said, we are at a strategic crossroad in NATO. But my area of focus is especially Russia. I'm really interested in Russian affairs, especially the Arctic region, where we see Russia being more active, but not only that, on all fronts, like Ukraine, the Baltic states. So I'm really looking forward to cover Russia, but also the Indo-Pacific and other areas. But also not only on the military front, but I think things such as political warfare and hybrid warfare are issues which we need to cover, because NATO really needs to start doing something about it. But we'll have time to discuss that. Thank you.
Yes, we sure will. Before we dive into more substantive matters, just for anyone watching, we have a couple of surveys. One you can take now, in which you'll be asked for your view, your perspective on the biggest challenges, the nature of the biggest challenges and threats facing NATO, whether they're internal or external, whether they're on the offensive end being perpetrated by state or non-state actors, externally and internally, whether the disconnect between NATO and its member states and their respective societies, or whether political factors within the institution pose the greatest threat. Towards the end of this panel, you will have the same survey in which you can indicate for the panel as well as for yourselves whether there was any change in thought or whether you had a difference of opinion as to what the biggest threats or largest looming discontinuities, the nature of them, are before NATO. So we can move to the meat of the panel, for lack of a better term. As far as the views of our panelists, Anka, we can start with you, and you can elaborate on, lay the groundwork for us. What threats is NATO facing, and which ones loom the largest, and which ones should the alliance and individual member states look to address first over the long term?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you, Kellen, for the setup. So I will provide a caveat from the very beginning to say that per the introduction that you provided, I spend most of my time at the intersection of transatlantic security and strategic foresight. So that is a very systematic way to think about what will happen in the future. And so my painting of the landscape that we are in will necessarily be a bit broad, but I'm sure my panelists will provide much more color on these set of issues than I could. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's fair to say that NATO is in many ways at a crossroads in terms of modernizing and being able to respond to the challenges on the horizon. Where I stand, I would say that we are in a very difficult landscape. As I mentioned earlier, we have the classic great power rivalry strategic environment coming back, where NATO is very much kind of snapping back into its traditional defense deterrence role. And I'm sure both my panelists will have much to say about China and Russia in that regard. This poses its own set of challenges, of course, but I think in a way it's fair to say that this is the bread and butter of the alliance. This is what NATO has been doing for the past 70 plus years. And as a result of that, I would argue that maybe that's more attuned to the mission and to its DNA, and therefore less of a concern. What I see, on the other hand, and what concerns me by taking a long-term view of the future, is the increase in so-called non-traditional challenges. So that I'll describe in a second, and that I think require a fundamental rethinking of NATO's capabilities, institutional changes, and formats of collaboration, for lack of a better word, that the alliance should take. And I think that this is honestly where NATO has the most work to do, but also where there's the most potential for improvement and for responding to a set of challenges before they materialize and before they have a fundamental impact. So I'd say with that in mind, they could be fit into three big buckets. Again, taking a long view analysis. The first one is an increase in transnational threats, and this includes stuff like pandemics and climate change and irregular migration. And it's fair to say that many of these threats are traditionally outside of what NATO was meant to do, but I think increasingly they will increase and pervade every single part of NATO's operations and the institutional way in which it works. The panel before us was talking about climate change and talked about climate change as a threat multiplier. I think that's a perfect way to describe how these threats will manifest. They will impact the way operations are carried out, our ability to mobilize quickly. They will make our societies more fragile and will generally potentially undermine cohesion within the transatlantic space and beyond. So I'd say they will be mainstreamed across the set of operations that we will have to deal with, and as a result of it, are particularly pernicious and hard to pinpoint. The second, I'd say, set of challenges that I'm seeing from a strategic foresight perspective is an increase in gray zone activities. And I think Guillaume mentioned this earlier, but we're seeing increased use of cyber attacks, hybrid warfare, political warfare, coercive economic statecraft. All of these activities that tiptoe around and below the threshold of the use of force and the declaring Article 5, and which in many ways allow adversaries like China and Russia to level the playing field, to be able to challenge the alliance from a position where their asymmetry is managed. So I think that even as we speak about great power rivalry and the return to defense and deterrence, it's equally important to consider that these great power adversaries may be using asymmetric and other tools to kind of democratize the field and be able to challenge NATO from a position of strength. And then finally, I'd say the last bit of this, and this is maybe the only internal threat that the alliance is facing, is one of democratic recession. And this is in no ways unique to the transatlantic community, though I'd say that this is where it's mostly felt. And I would argue that this is the result of a general perceived failure of the liberal democratic model. The financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then now the COVID pandemic have compounded this idea that the relationship with the state is not delivering, that our wages are stagnating, distrust is at an all-time high. And this is, again, not within the purview of NATO, but I think fundamentally dangerous because it undermines the social fabric that keeps societies cohesive and makes them much more vulnerable to attack. So again, that's a lot to take in, and I'm sure we'll dig into it. But what I'll leave everyone with, I think, is I think the challenge ahead of us that was laid out very eloquently by the NATO 20 survey reflection group. And I think it was mentioned as a challenge of strategic simultaneity. So the idea that NATO has a variety of threats coming at it at full speed, some of which are intertwined. And the challenge ahead of us, and this brings us to the political part, will be how to prioritize and then politically how to cooperate so that when they do hit, we're prepared and the alliance bounces back stronger as it has in the past in every situation, and is prepared to what's ahead. So how we manage strategic simultaneity and how we're going to be able to politically push through it, I think is what's on the horizon for us and what I'm excited to figure out today. Thank you.
Great, very insightful, very substantive. Andrew, we'll go over to you, whether it's just something Anka said that you want to build on, or whether you just want to introduce us to a fresh perspective as to the greatest challenges and threats NATO is running up against over the medium term or the long term, or even near term threats.
Yeah, thanks, Callan. I think Anka pretty much had a great encompass of the challenges NATO is facing, and as she was talking about intra problems that the alliance is having, I just couldn't help but think of, especially in my work of analyzing the Indo-Pacific and how that can relate to NATO's obviously mission of the transatlantic security and defense, and then also being a pillar of the rules-based order. I think one thing that is also kind of driving inter-alliance problems in terms of cohesion and unity in developing either a strategy or developing a collaborative outlook of engagement with either state actors or non-state actors is essentially the rise of, as Anka said, great power competition, but also what that does to the major powers within NATO. I mean, if we look at the United States, we look at Great Britain, and then we look at France, they've all individually either tilted their foreign policy or pivoted completely in the Pacific. And what we're seeing at this point is conflicting foreign strategies with how to engage, nations like China, how do they engage their neighbors like Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, or regional organizations like ASEAN. And we're already starting to see kind of small little ramifications that have, I would say, not major implications, but minor ones that can transform into major ones. And if you just look at the recent trilateral security pact with Australia, United States, and United Kingdom, AUKUS, right? The United States and Great Britain supplying and being in development with Australia to develop nuclear power submarines when France had a prior deal. And even though France publicly was dismayed with that and recalled their ambassador from the region, these small instances of not being able to collectively have an outlook and engagement strategy for the Indo-Pacific, I think will pose one of the biggest problems in the coming decades, especially as we get to the centennial of the Communist Chinese Party. Something that during that mandate, Xi has said he wants to accomplish his Chinese dream of obviously reunifying Taiwan and also really reinforcing Chinese regional hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. So I would just try and reiterate and reinforce that the lack of strategic consensus with how to develop an ex-regional strategy among not just the major powers, but all of the powers, small, minor, and middle of NATO, I think is going to be a huge driving point for inter-alliance cohesion going forward. And it's something that we've seen has been exploited, not just by Russia in terms of cyber attacks and energy diplomacy, but something China has also done as well with economic coercion and economic diplomacy with its Belt and Road Initiative and its economic investments in the Balkans and the Baltics and Eastern Europe. So I think that I would just add that to what Anka said about internal and intra-alliance problems.
Great. One thing that I left out in the introduction for the audience before we move to Guillaume is there is a live Q&A feed for the audience should they want to submit any questions at any point over the course of the panel. Should there be questions in queue, we will probably wait to answer those on the latter quarter of the panel time frame. But just so that everybody's aware of that, that is something that I omitted before we got started. So without further ado, Guillaume, what are your thoughts on the biggest challenges NATO faces and the implications of them?
Yeah, I think my two other co-panelists have already alluded to it. And I think there is indeed an external and an internal dimension. Externally, clearly the rise of China and a more assertive, even aggressive Russia. But I think that NATO is still seen too much as a military alliance. I mean, it was formed as a military alliance, but as Anka said, there is political warfare, hybrid warfare, and I think these are aspects of power. I mean, you have hard power like military power, economic power, and political power. But Russia and China have been playing a more subtle game. So they have been. Sorry, I got a bit lost. But no, sorry, I forgot my words.
No, that's quite all right, because we can actually circle back to a point that Anka made in the beginning part of her remarks. I believe you said, Anka, something along the lines of, given the current geopolitical landscape, NATO's snapping back is the term you used, into its traditional defense role. But my what I would contend, and what I'm sure the three of you would contend to varying extents as well, is falling back on the alliance's bread and butter, to coin the phrase Anka used. Is that misguided? Is falling back on NATO's traditional role? Do we think that's inadequate to meet the discontinuities and the challenges that lie ahead in the long term? Or is there some value in reverting back to that traditional role? Because what comes to mind for me, somebody who is new, relatively still new to living in Europe, when I hear discourse around NATO now, I keep thinking of Emmanuel Macron's speech where he referred to NATO's brain death. So are we playing into, is that the prevailing narrative when we speak of NATO falling back into its traditional role, or do you guys have a different opinion? Anybody can have the floor first. Perhaps Anka, you first, since I'm referring to your remarks, and then everybody else can chime in as they wish.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and I love how you're setting us up to debate you. I think maybe what I'll start by saying is that I think in many ways NATO is a victim of its own success, and what I mean by that is NATO is the reason why we sometimes forget what NATO does or think that NATO is brain dead, I would argue, is because nothing happens. But that's a result of a very successful set of decades where NATO's defense and deterrence actually worked. So paradoxically, because we're not seeing any incidents happening, I think that's just an endorsement of what NATO has been doing. And so to answer your question, Kellen, I think it's number one, it's really important that NATO builds on that, especially in the sense of responding to Russia, which was what Guillaume was referring to, I think, and responding also in the Indo-Pacific, and building up its conventional capabilities to continue in that very successful endeavor. But I don't think it's an either or, if that's what you were getting at, Kellen. I don't think necessarily doing more in terms of defense and deterrence means that we have to do less when it comes to other non-traditional threats, which is where I'm coming from and what concerns me on a day-to-day basis. I think, as I was saying earlier, it's a question of how to prioritize among the two, what is important to respond to in the near term versus the medium term versus the long term. I think Andrew was referring to that the challenge in the Indo-Pacific is already taking place, but it's in many ways, I think, on a longer timeline than the very immediate Russian threat on the eastern flank. And also, I think, what instruments to use. We have an alliance that has an incredible array of frameworks and institutions at its disposal, not to mention that so many of its member states are actually EU member states too, which raises, I think, the onus on NATO-EU cooperation that I see personally as a very good shortcut to manage this dilemma and to be able to respond to this host of challenges that are facing the transatlantic community and that we need to get out of together. But let me stop there. I'm sure my panelists have many more intelligent things to say.
Anyone else, feel free to chime in as you wish.
Yeah, Anka, brought up a great point with, the longevity of NATO and, the successes of its mandate for security, defense and deterrence that, has resulted from that. And, as she said, with the Indo-Pacific, it's very much, a long-term strategy compared to, to Russia and the assertiveness that they have, shown in the past and have reasserted, towards Ukraine and near the borders of NATO members. I think something that plagues NATO a little bit is that everywhere within its members, right, there are threats that take more precedent. If you look at, the Eastern members, obviously in the Eastern flank, with Russia being right there, that's going to take more onus. If you're looking at the Southern flank countries like, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and some of the Balkan states, you're going to see, terrorist organizations and, forced mass migrations taking much more of a concern. If you look at, the northern, Arctic flank, obviously Russia, China's near Arctic status that was, just recently approved in 2013, that would take precedence. And then if you look at Canada, United States, I think there's, an issue that doesn't really get too much attention and light on is its Western flank, right? We always hear that, NATO has these different flanks, but not too much consensus or kind of strategic outlook has been put towards the Western flank, which does exist among its members. Although it only encompasses 2 members that, possess a very large geographical borders, and obviously it's a region that, is guarded and guided by the principal ally that is the United States. We've already seen where the Biden administration and before him with the Trump administration, their outlook is towards the Indo-Pacific. So I think that everywhere where you are within NATO has, different dilemmas, different problems that they see the alliance and its traditional roles in maintaining their interests within the alliance. So is that something that's going to get much more, I guess, is it going to be much more of a dilemma that's going to increase over time, or is NATO going to be able to, come back, draw its members back and consensusly, in the consensus, build up its, its acknowledgement of all the different problems that it has and kind of have one driving force for its role for, transatlantic security and defense.
Great. Guillaume, do you have any comment on the matter? Anything you want to add to take things in a different direction? What do you see when you look out in terms of challenges and threats the alliance will face that it may be unprepared for?
Yeah, I think it's especially on the political front. When you read the reports, the NATO 2030 report or the report of the Secretary General, the annual report, you see that there is constantly a call for more consultation between the allies. And I think recent events have shown that in terms of allies, different allies have different priorities, but also if you look at the AUKUS Pact, I think there has not been consultation between for instance, the partners, so US, UK, Australia, and France. And France is a NATO ally, US and UK too. And this was a major issue, and I think President Biden recognized it, that he should have consulted with the European allies. But it's not only the AUKUS Pact. I think it's different countries that have different priorities, but we see that there is not so much consultation within NATO. But yeah, people forget that NATO is the only transatlantic forum, and what we see is in terms of political warfare, is China and Russia trying to go towards the countries individually, trying to get them away from NATO. And this is a major problem because right now there is no institutional structure where allies really consult with each other and form a sort of common front. And yeah, that's dangerous because what you see Russia doing, for instance, is they constantly call out NATO, constantly call out the EU, say how mean they are and stuff like that. But towards individual countries, they say, oh, look, but we respect the sovereignty, we respect the UN Charter, so we want to negotiate on a bilateral basis. But it's just the EU we don't like. It's NATO we don't like, but we like you. But it's actually very subtle, but it's powerful because from a bilateral point of view, Russia is stronger than most countries in Europe. And so if they can make these countries leave their multinational setting, then these countries are going to have, it's way more difficult to oppose Russia. For instance, take my country, Belgium, very small country. If Belgium had to negotiate with Russia, we are way weaker than if we negotiated in a EU or NATO setting. So I think this is the major threat, and this is what, well, experts have been calling upon, is consultation. I think calling for more defense is, okay, it's good, but it's again the military dimension. I think that the military dimension of security is only one dimension, and we need to invest in other types of security. We see actually in all sectors, economy, finance, technology. I think our own, in Belgium, the National Security Agency warns against, for instance, buying Chinese smartphones, because actually these smartphones are, let's say, kind of full of spyware, and all this information goes back to Beijing. So these are, it's gray zone. It's not warfare, but it's very dangerous because data, for instance, data is an important tool. And what we see is that in the technology sector, this will be a major issue if we do not come together as NATO allies. Yeah.
Great. I see, I'm sure our other panelists want to have something to add. One brief thing that I want to add is all three of you have to various extents touched on matters that leave NATO unprepared for future threats, which the alliance has agency over, in theory, to change on its own. But a point that Guillaume just mentioned was your home country of Belgium. If they are negotiating, you negotiate on a weaker footing when you negotiate individually, rather than coming together in unison as a bloc. And one of the other, as far as Belgium vis-a-vis Russia, one of the other instances that I thought of is earlier this year, where you have the foreign ministry in Lithuania really speaking out about what the EU, which is not NATO, but what the EU as a multilateral body needs to do to counter China effectively. And you saw their foreign minister mention what the actionable steps China had been doing to essentially pick off Central and Eastern European states, some of which were EU members, to play on various economic and non-security interests. And also one of the things that you see play out across Europe is how various member states' interests are manifested. So you have the coalition talks for a government in Germany, in which one of the coalition partners, the Greens, are somewhat, to varying extents, somewhat skeptical or outright hostile to some key pillars of NATO. You have conflicts between NATO members that have flared up in recent years, such as Greece and Turkey. And you have still more members, such as the United States, who are trying to prioritize China and coax NATO allies into devoting more resources to meet the China challenge. But when those smaller member states have deployed hard assets to the Indo-Pacific, such as naval vessels or military personnel, they haven't explicitly committed to the narrative of why Washington says they might be there. So another thing to think about as we move forward is, to what extent do we have to sort through our own policy and political roadblocks to strengthen the fabric of the alliance? You can also ignore that to the other panelists if you had a prior point to make, but that's just something I thought of. So Anka, over to you.
Sure. No, that's a great setup, but maybe I'll just pick on something Guillaume said, because I think his point was spot on. Part of course, NATO's value resides in its defense, right? And the fact that it's the most important military alliance that has existed. But I think Guillaume is absolutely right in saying that the alliance is also important politically, not only in allowing the member states to have a forum for consultation, which is incredibly important, but I would argue in also reinforcing the value of the transatlantic community and being there as a beacon of what the transatlantic community stands for. And one example I wanted to give, which I think is really important in terms of the value that NATO can bring, even when it comes to challenges outside of its traditional realm of responsibilities, is the COVID-19 pandemic, where, again, it's an event traditionally speaking outside of NATO's area of operations, but nonetheless, NATO structures kind of jolted into action. NATO, facilitated the distribution of material and equipment among member states. It aided with airlift. It disinfected, border crossings and whatnot. There was, I think, I'm trying to remember a vaccination response, as part of NATO at NATO HQ. All of that, I think, matters, because it shows that the alliance is not only there to defend us, but it also delivers on some of these issues that are closer, I think, to many of its populations. And as a result of it, it reinforces the connection and this political weight that the alliance has. So I think Guillaume is spot on, and it's definitely something to consider.
Andrew, you wanted to add something as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to build off, what Guilherme and Anaka, very eloquently, detailed in their responses. I guess I would just want to build off that another issue that is really hindering the alliance, cohesion, unity in developing, a new strategic concept, which is, NATO 2030. We hear this all the time. We heard it with, when Biden was newly elected. He went to NATO headquarters and preached that NATO's strategic concept needs to adapt and reinvigorate itself for the coming challenges. And I think that for that to occur, and Guilherme was absolutely correct when he said there isn't a center, or there isn't an institutional framework or organization within NATO to actually have concrete and constructive discussions about the political, institutional, military, and defense aspect that NATO has obviously encompassed over its extensive existence. And there have been calls and mandates to have essentially redraw a new Atlantic Charter for the alliance. The charter still mimics a post-World War II Cold War environment. And then when that was over, obviously it was kind of, what do we do now? And what we saw during the Clinton years was obviously, well, if we enlarge the alliance to encompass, former Warsaw Pact, then we're essentially initiating kind of their reinvigoration into a democratic and liberal Europe. And I would contend, and I think it's a strong contention, that if it wasn't for that extension, I think former Warsaw Pacts wouldn't have entered into the EU. And then after the Clinton years, we had the Bush and the Obama administration in the American unipolar moment, as it's also often called, where we'll transition into peacekeeping and anti-terrorist operations. And I think right now transatlanticism as a whole is kind of stuck in this. Well, what's our purpose for the coming decades? Is it strategic competition with a foe like Russia? Is it a strategic competition with a rising China that isn't really in our sphere as of yet? So I think definitely that's something that NATO and its leaders need to really consider going forward, is, what does transatlanticism mean in this modern era and to each state? And how can we build upon that to ensure that, it reflects all the needs of the members, not just the major powers and, the principal ally, the United States. And I think a way to do that is to, essentially create a transatlantic council. And this is, this organization within NATO could, incentivize greater intergovernmental cooperation, at head of state meetings, ministerial and institutional summits, along with, transatlantic economic organizations like the European Union, or the newly drafted CUSMA from with Canada, the United States, Mexico.
Definitely great points. Guillaume, would you like to add to anything either Andrew or Anka said, or add your own bit?
Yeah, I'll add to what Andrew said. I think when he spoke about the charter and that it still reflects a Cold War mentality, I think right now the problem for NATO is that threats are becoming more global. We see a shift towards the Indo-Pacific, while before Europe was still the sort of major theater with Russia as the major threat. But now with the rise of China and things as climate change and other terrorism and other global threats, I think it's a sort of introspection and existential question for NATO of, okay, how do we do it now? Because for the Europeans, it's well, we have our own problems in Europe, but we now have to understand that the Pacific is going to become more important, so that we also will have to be more active in the Indo-Pacific. And we see that only now has the EU developed a strategy for the Indo-Pacific, but that is on a multilateral setting. But if you look at the countries individually, European countries, I think only a few countries in Europe, like France, Germany, Netherlands, have specific Indo-Pacific strategies, but the rest don't. So how do you want to negotiate in a NATO setting if other countries still haven't thought about it? So we really need to start thinking about it, of a more global NATO. And I think it's difficult for the Europeans because, well, especially on the military domain, we still have trouble. We still have trouble to do operations without the help of the United States. So it will be a real challenge for Europe to really, well, take its own responsibility and become more active on a global level. Yeah, politically and militarily.
Great points by all three of you. I could raise and re-raise different matters that could elicit a variety of responses from you guys, but we do have questions from the audience, and I do want to make sure that I try to hew as close to the timeline as I can so that the audience has ample opportunity to engage with the panel. So one question we have is, what about the forthcoming NATO strategic concept? How should it be sketched so that the alliance's core tasks will be adopted to 21st century realities? And this is an open question, so any of the three of you can answer as you see fit.
I mean, I can take a stab at it. I think it's a phenomenal question, and we think about it all the time too, about how the strategic concept should look like. And I think it's fair to say from the very beginning that it will be a particularly important strategic concept, in the sense that I think we have a limited window of action on a variety of issues that we've already been talking about and that will definitely need to be included in the strategic concept. So I'm thinking here about responding to China's rise, climate change, for example. The window is closing, and so I think there's a lot of weight on this strategic concept to deliver and to allow for, let's say, coordination and agreement in spite of many of the shortcomings that exist in terms of finding common ground and the diverging threat assessments that exist among member states that Guillaume and Andrew explained so well. In terms of how it can be adapted, I am a bit biased, so I will recognize that from the very beginning. But I think a core issue that the new strategic concept should focus on extensively is resilience. I think in this environment, it is absolutely impossible, and as tragic as that might sound, to be able to respond to every single threat that comes at us. It's just it's just impossible. There's just too much. So I think the alliance needs, first of all, a shift in mindset where we accept that risk is in some cases inevitable, and we focus extensively on how we can prepare for that risk, how we can recover, and then moving forward, how we can learn and do better next time. So, what that means, I think, is raising the level of ambition when it comes to resilience at a very minimum, dedicating resources to it, increasing situational awareness, early warning systems, information sharing, all of that. But I would argue we can go even further maybe and use existing NATO structures to make some headway when it comes to resilience. In a piece that I wrote a long time ago, we were talking extensively about how to mainstream resilience. And I think one easy way to do it is to use the NDPP. It's a great structure. It allows for coordination, capability development across the alliance. And I think it's a very natural next step in a way to use the framework that NDPP provides to be able to make progress on resilience. That's just one very practical example, but I think the broader point stands. We need to admit that we can't prepare for everything, and so it's equally important to change our mindset and come from a place where we can bounce not only back but bounce forward as a result of the institutional structures, policies, resources, and collaboration structures that we have to dedicate to this.
Anyone else can also address the question if you like. Free reign, absolutely.
Yeah, I think Anka brings up a good point. I think it's something that has been discussed thoroughly throughout this whole conference is the idea of resiliency, right? How can NATO be resilient to the upcoming challenges and incorporate into its strategic concept going forward? I think one of the first areas that NATO should really take a hard look at is Article 3 of the Washington Treaty. I mean, the provisions within the article, sets up the conditions needed for collective resiliency to what it calls major shocks, and we've had panels to discuss that. However, Article 3 has limitations. It only combines civil preparedness with the alliance's military capacity. And we have seen, with China's great rise and the cyber capacity that Russia has presented, that this has really exacerbated, extra-regional and regional involvement of antagonistic or, revisionist powers that seek to, make, the rules-based international order, whether that be, within a regional context or a global context, within, with their perspectives and with their norms and values at the center of it. And this obviously has huge implications with respect to regulating political and economic issues. So, with China in particular, China has been actively, engaged in exploiting, bilateral economic ties with, small and minor powers. And this does impede cohesion among, NATO states that, especially small NATO states, that don't want to engage too heavily and too fast with China because they fear the economic, setbacks that may cause. And then obviously you have the major powers who want to take a very aggressive and a very assertive, fast-paced direction towards the Indo-Pacific. And so I think, I definitely think that NATO needs to make sure that Article 3 is updated in such a way that it really brings forward issues and mechanisms that can really resolve these kind of problems. And I think one way to do it, and Anka has said it, is more cooperation and collaboration with the European Union. In particular, I think that they should, bring forward resiliency towards civilian technologies and, economic institutions. And the way that they could do this within Article 3 and the European Union is to essentially combine the legal and financial instruments with NATO's civilian and military stakeholders to build up the alliance's expertise on being pragmatic, practical, and essentially be revelatory on security and defense issues, along with aligning the region's political and economic preparedness to the era's hybrid threats, which can range from anything from, as we said, state versus non-state actors, but I think also from regional and extra-regional threats and military, non-military threats. And I think in doing so, NATO can be maybe a little bit more assertive in its position to extend into new frontiers and really put its own values and norms on issues instead of being a little hesitant for not wanting to upset the rules-based order. And I think something that NATO has to take into account is that it's no longer atop the world, right? It's amid it. And if it's amid the world, it needs to be a lot more resilient and forceful in projecting what it sees as beneficial to its members, to its perspectives of how the world should engage with each other, and the institutions that can guide prosperity and stability for obviously peace and economic prosperity for all.
Yeah, if I can build upon the points that you made about resilience, I think a strategic concept should really incorporate the whole of government approach. I think countries are talking about it because we see that when we talk about national security, many people still think the military, especially, but what we see now is in terms of political warfare, what China is doing is not necessarily in the European states, it's not military aggression, but it's rather economic coercion and trying to lure states away with their deals. So we see that security is interrelated in the different sectors. And what we have now in NATO, I think, is a sort of aggregate of national interest and national capacities. But this whole of government approach, some countries have it. I think, although Finland is not a NATO state, they do have a sort of whole of government approach because they have more experience in it. So we should share best practices with them and to recognize that we should not think in terms of categories, not like, okay, this is military security, this is economic security, this is technological security, but it's all interrelated. And Russia and China are, well, their campaigns that they are launching is a total campaign. So they don't only think about military security, but they are really on all fronts. And the more we wait to find a common response to this, the more, the weaker we become. So, but this will require that we do more together as NATO or as the EU. And there's a question is, are people in these countries ready for it? Because as Anka said, there is a democratic backlash. So democracy is trust in the institutions is weakening. So I think we'll also need to put in more effort on communicating towards the public and really try to get more support, because public opinion right now towards NATO is positive in all countries. But yeah, if we do more together, we really need people to understand why we do this, because otherwise they will not understand. And this could, of course, backfire against NATO. So, but this whole of government approach is important for strategic concept.
You guys can still tie these back to other points that you wanted to make, but I do want to get into the next questions so that we have enough time to give our audience responses. The next two questions are from the same viewer, so I will do my best to combine them into one. How was the alliance impacted by COVID-19? Based on this, how would the three of you assess the role of non-state actors, particularly in the context of the so-called infodemic? So I assume this relates to a degree, misinformation and disinformation in the age of pandemic preparedness and any collateral damage, if there is, the alliance suffers in that regard. So any of you can respond to that point in question as you see fit.
So,
Okay,
go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Okay. Sorry. I think, yeah, the COVID pandemic is a good example that it's a military threat is not necessary to really, how should I put it? to really create a crisis in our countries. The COVID pandemic is not a military threat. It was simply a virus, but we see how unprepared we actually were. If you remember the early days of the pandemic, the shortages of masks and medical supplies, and even a sort of nationalism between the countries, which were hoarding stocks for themselves, like a me first. And I think China and Russia have been very active in the propaganda fronts on social media and other domains. So to say, look, you're not doing things together. They are actually they are not your brothers. They don't care about you. So, and this is dangerous. This was only a virus, so or only a pandemic. So are we really prepared for the next crisis? I think this is why we have talked about resilience, and this is why it is so important. And we need to start to learn from this crisis and to do more things together. And communications is, I think, for me, one is also part of security. I think communications and social media are the next battleground, if I may put it in military terms, because public support, I think, is going to be way more important than military preparedness. I think it's also, if the people really need to support what we are doing. Otherwise, it's only an aggregate of military troops, but there needs to be a collective transatlantic understanding of, yes, we are doing this together.
Yeah, I think I can respond to maybe the first part of the question especially, but I think it's fair to say that the COVID-19 pandemic, as I was mentioning earlier, definitely, I think, brought home the idea that NATO needs to expand its conceptualization of security policy, and that it needs to have a much broader definition, as Guillaume was mentioning earlier, that not only includes a whole of society approach, but a host of issues that up until now maybe the alliance was somewhat minimizing, let's say. So I think in that regard, we knew that pandemics were happening. We knew that climate change was an issue. We knew that technology was evolving and that we would have cyber attacks. But I think the pandemic, definitely COVID-19, brought this home and increased the level of ambition and I think also the urgency in responding to it. The other part that I will say is that I think it also brought home the point that NATO needs a much more expansive framework to respond to these threats. And in general, I think increasingly the alliance is starting to realize that these threats are pervasive and include every part of society. So include state structures, include the private sector, include civil society in general. And I think that we're seeing increasingly an emphasis of NATO reaching out to new communities. So reaching out to the private sector, for instance, when it comes to technology and innovation, reaching out to civil society and working with folks who are in the first line of defense when it comes to, say, a major incident, because you need all of these forces, and because I think ultimately a successful response starts from the local level. So in many ways, I guess to sum that up, the pandemic brought home a lot of ideas that were floating in the air, but I think fundamentally crystallized this notion that NATO needs to expand its definition of security and the institutions and structures that it uses for it. So let me stop there.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend to know exactly how the COVID pandemic affected NATO. This is not an area that I have extensive knowledge in. But what I will say is that it also brought forward a new diplomatic concept, and that's vaccine diplomacy. Right? We've seen the Russians' vaccine Sputnik and the Chinese vaccine Sinovac, essentially as a way of these two powers to exploit internal and intra-alliance inability to have discussions and to, like Anka said, that framework of being prepared for such a major shock. And if NATO wants to avoid, I would say, certain issues with that, I think that their framework should encompass definitely some kind of strategic outlook on how vaccine diplomacy will be, I guess, an influential dilemma that will, that can essentially be used by, its rivals or its adversaries, or even, with some of its members going forward.
All great points. I will switch gears and go to more of a, I suppose, a rapid fire response. We do have a last question, but given that we are running up on time constraints, I want to make sure we have time for it because I think it neatly sums up a lot of the points brought up in the panel and also ties back to a specific point about what NATO can do to perhaps paper over or heal some of the fang fabrics within the alliance. And the question is, are further binding legislation or mediation mechanisms through policy, I suppose, needed to deal with certain heads of state of NATO members who act contrary to alliance interests? And I just a tidbit that I can add is when I originally read the question, I thought in military terms, for instance, the issue that NATO's been having with Turkey, a member state, is the acquisition of air missile defense systems that aren't compatible with those that other brokers within the alliance, major brokers within the alliance, would like to see. But I'm sure that there are many ways to answer the question, so very curious about all of your thoughts.
I mean, I can take the first stab at that. I think it's a great question, and I guess color me skeptical a little bit in terms of saying that maybe binding agreements are the way to go. I see the value of them. I understand what the question is getting at, but I think in many ways the best way to build political cohesion and help the alliance move forward in spite of all of these internal and external threats that are coming at it is delivering. It's a rapid fire response, but I think the more the alliance can not only respond to these threats, as we saw in the case of COVID-19, where it mobilized and was able to make a very tangible impact in the lives of populations in member states, and also make it very clear from a strategic communications perspective what it is doing and that its value is there. I think that's the easiest way to build, maybe to reinforce the value of what the alliance stands for, build popular support for it, and therefore, as a result of it, I think brings some more cohesion. So short answer is maybe less enforcing structures and maybe more just delivering on the promise of the alliance as it was established many decades ago.
Yeah, just to build off that point, I think Aga brings up a lot of a very valid skepticism with mechanisms or legislative enforcements that can resolve such an issue. I guess I would just build off by saying I think if these issues occur and are ongoing, which I foresee them to be, I think NATO members individually, and I really want to stress that quite heavily, individually need to be aware that if they individually or bilaterally or trilaterally get involved into these disputes, I think it looks bad on the alliance as a result, because it shows that one or two nations disagree with that, and that just shows that there is no cohesion and there's disunity in gathering consensus and support. And I just a couple of days ago, the Biden administration just amended their previously established mutual defense cooperation agreement with Greece over the growing diplomatic tensions with Erdogan's Turkey, which Kellen, you've cited. I think instead of approaching matters like that, I think NATO as a collective should be the driver in these dilemmas. It should be the General Secretary members of the alliance and not the member states and their corresponding leaders taking the initiative. I think NATO really needs to take the reins as an organization and showcase that, you know, it is the organization that represents all. And if, you know, if these matters occur, then it needs to be at the forefront of communications, political and institutional disputes.
Yeah, just rapid fire response. I think NATO is only an alliance, so yeah, unless you go to a setting like the EU, I don't think you can really enforce something. But as Anka said, it's about public support. I think the political elite are worried about public support. So communications is important, because if population is attached to NATO, attached to this transatlantic bond, and says, no, we can't do that because of our NATO allies, I think this will change the calculus. But yeah, right now, these things show NATO disunity between the allies, and this is something that other external players, but even internally, will be used against NATO. So again, communications is the most important here, before we maybe can go towards more binding agreements.
Excellent. Just kind of thinking about in review of this panel, you know, you think you've covered a lot of ground and you really haven't even gotten started. I said before we went live that, you know, it's in an hour, 10 minutes, it's really difficult to squeeze in all of the real pressing and pivotal issues that will determine the future posture of the alliance militarily and politically. Unfortunately, we could probably spend an indefinite amount of time covering these issues, but I'm glad that we were able to get through the audience questions, and a sincere thank you for the valuable contributions of the panelists, Anka, Andrew, and Guillaume. And I hope that the audience has learned some valuable insights. They can take the second Slido survey so that we can observe whether there was any changes. But our initial response showed that among viewers, external threats were seen as the most pressing and immediate discontinuities. Although in my personal opinion, in my own bias, I would tend to agree with some of the things our panelists said that shine the spotlight on internal factors that will have the potential to have a much broader effect on the alliance as a whole and individual member states. So thank you to the three of you for joining us. We really appreciate you joining us, particularly on a Sunday afternoon. I'm sure that you guys have other things and priorities you need to take care of. And thank you for those of you in the audience who have joined us not only for this panel, but those that have taken part in prior panels over this weekend. I wish everybody a great rest of the afternoon, morning or evening, depending on where everyone is located. And I hope that you all take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Nothing better than talking NATO over coffee Eastern.
You win again, extraterrestrial beast. Games are just a fun way to waste time, right? Not necessarily. Playing games could lead to new ways to combat modern threats. That's what we're looking at today in NATO Science. Around the world, people spend billions of hours a week playing games. But what if, rather than playing games aimlessly, we could divert this time and effort into solving security problems? Our scientist in Ankara has more.
I always remember a military trainer telling me, I have students playing Fortnite and I'm trying to teach them using PowerPoint. We use games at NATO to play through different scenarios. In the future, threats could come from all sides. Disinformation, urban warfare, cyber attacks, civil unrest, robots, drones, even augmented humans. Using games helps us imagine these scenarios.
The game is on, but how does it work?
We give our teams a problem and assign them different roles. Red team are hostile forces, green are the legitimate government, blue is NATO, yellow might be other non-governmental factors like aid workers or displaced people. Imagine a megacity of 10 million people divided into zones based on ethnicity. A hostile country uses those divisions as an excuse to capture the city's port, which is a lifeline to the citizens. But the hostile country doesn't use regular troops. They use unmarked paramilitary forces. Whatever methods NATO might use to stabilize that crisis, cyber, information, or kinetic, will have consequences for the population. A facilitator watching the game runs up a software that uses an algorithm that predicts the effects of each action. A riot, 1 point up the crisis meter. An epidemic, another point. If the crisis meter runs too high, NATO loses. The game is designed not to be won, but rather to manage the crisis and restore stability, which is one of the NATO's core tasks. But the game isn't the interesting part. It is the people who are playing. Where the science comes in is that we observe cognitive reactions. Although NATO
And we're live. Are we live? I think we're live. Wonderful, wonderful. Oh, right. I'm exhausted. I really am. And I can only imagine, Petra, how exhausted you must be, because this was absolutely, again, a most wonderful conference. The third in our series of online Atlantic Forum conferences. Aptly named now the autumn, which previously was named the fall, but we realized that if we were dedicating ourselves to the English lexicon, which is apparently trivia, NATO is using the British English, not the American English. So someone pointed out, like, right, so if that's, your whole website is supposed to be British English, and I think it is at the moment. Might be a few mistakes here and there. But then someone pointed out that we should actually be calling it a autumn conference rather than a fall conference. So that's a trivia for you. And for anyone who was wondering, like, hey, why was this last year called a fall conference? There you get it. But of course, I really do hope that the next one, which will still be named aptly Spring Conference, will be a physical one. But again, Petra, to you and your whole crew, credit for pulling off this digitally. And I'm still looking around to other organizations, seeing how they're doing it, and then again thinking that But at the end of the day, we are simply a young professional volunteer organization, seeing how we can pull off something like this. It's amazing. And then we actually didn't even talk about the content. So actually, I want to zoom in a bit on that. Now, you, of course, as the chair, you're supposed to love all your panels equally, supposedly. But what was your favorite part of these 3 days? Or is it just your favorite part that's now all over? I think we're having tech issues. No? Yes? Okay, no question for you, Petra. I'll just move on. I'm just going to talk about what I want.
Just the slight ones. I managed to fix them up. Don't you worry. If I had to choose one, it's kind of like asking you to choose who's your favorite child.
I mean, you all love them equally, but some you love better than others. That's perfectly fine.
You can't really say that, can you? No, it's really hard because they all kind of bounce off of each other really nicely. And they all fill each other's, I don't even want to call it gaps. It was mostly kind of thinking, building on whatever the previous panel said and kind of putting into further context. So we have seen this afternoon that we finished off with political systems, but we also looked into the hybrid, and we looked into cyber, and we looked into disinformation and misinformation, and so many aspects of it to choose from. I'm always slightly biased because hybrid warfare has stolen my kind of work and everything
That
else.
is your thing, isn't it?
It is kind of my thing, so it's hard to stay completely, objective as such. But I really can't pick and choose. Like, to stay as objective as I can possibly be, that's the one. All of them.
All of them. That's the only valid answer. I was thinking of again, I'm going very political correct here, is that what I love was not per se a panel per se, but really the intent of when Igor, and hopefully Igor is doing fine now. Actually, I haven't checked up with him. I think he's still doing fine. But Igor and I, when we started this back in 2019, which already feels such a long time ago because of this bloody pandemic, what was this idea that we felt we were inspired by actually the very first NATO engages back in Brussels 18, where we saw young professionals on stage being equal, if you will, to sort of the regular speakers that you see at these kind of conferences. And for me, that was like a proof, like, look, this is possible. And I think we have to move away from the whole idea of young professionals, that the young part makes them special. They're just professionals in their own right. They're doing great stuff within the transatlantic community. And we should have more of that. We shouldn't be looking around. Like our generation, I thought on a couple of panels that actually was mentioned, that we shouldn't be looking around and looking for others or looking for the previous generation to say, right, so what are we going to do? What are you going to do about it? But really ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it? And that's, of course, also what we ended on Friday with. So there, I just love the synergy of having this sort of the experts, the retired ones, or the ones that are currently in top positions, and I think we had quite a few of those. Of course, starting with Brigade General Palome, but also today we ended up with a retired admiral and retired general from the Netherlands. We had CMC on stage, we had Ace Chief and Wheel on stage, but all with a very nice combination of our own generation, our own peers, who prove once and once again that they got something to bring to the table, and that rather than us being the audience and consuming of these products, it's really other people that should start listening to us. I mean, no, that's wrong. It's not that they have to start listening. Yeah, they already are. And NATO has shown that with the NATO 2030, the Young Leaders Report, with the NATO Youth Summit, with whatever they're planning again for the upcoming year, it's definitely, we've seen a change. And I'm just very happy that we, we're a modest little Atlantic Forum, are able to contribute to that. So that's a very long answer to the question. It's like, what did I like about this? And I'm very looking forward to build forward on that. So already next week, we've got more climate change coming up. So this time we are joining Tom and Ben in Rotterdam in the Netherlands to further discuss climate change. We've got our engagements with the Center of Excellence coming up. We've got more David Van Wheel coming up in November. We're talking disinformation there together again with a brilliant crowd of young professionals who are going to train other young professionals with peer-to-peer training. So much stuff that we can build on this. And I really hope that can nicely sort of have its own little apex to get together in April next year when we're again celebrating NATO's anniversary, our own anniversary, and hopefully do this in person in Brussels this time around. I'm just looking very forward to gather a crowd of our generation together, because that's the only element that I'm missing out of these conferences now is lacking the physical interaction. And then a lot of panelists talked about it, right? We would have loved to be able to sit down after this panel and then discuss a little bit further over a cup of coffee, see what comes out of that. So that's, I think, where our next move lies. Before going that far ahead, and of course we are going to invite all the young professionals who have been involved as panelists, as young professionals contributing, to join our ranks as well. But there's another way, I think, that we're going to involve people, isn't there?
Yeah, so as you can see on our right hand side from the two of us, you have joinslido.com with the. Can you not hear me?
Okay, I'm not seeing it.
Oh, yeah, you can't see because it's outside, it's on
Yeah.
YouTube. So, yeah. But the rest of our viewers, they can see the QR code and the access code as well, which is if you go onto slido.com and put a hashtag with the code 684336. I feel like I'm in a call center. If you do that one, you can join us in our closing ceremony questionnaire brainstorming session. So just so we can see what we have done in the last 3 days, how far have we got in understanding of what resilience really stands for, what these continuities are, how we can better prepare for them, just to kind of see where we're standing after these 3 days of debate and presentation and looking into something that is very much out there, which is very much, it's very abstract, sometimes hard to conceive. But in all of that, we would like to see what you're doing and how is your thinking advanced and where you're standing in this given moment. It's open for everybody, both patrons and not patrons at the moment. So if you would like to join us, by all means, hop on. We will have it live right next to us, so it can come up as we go along. I just wanted to build on a couple of notions that you raised in your speech as well. My great pride for this conference is lying in the fact that we have truly managed to establish a transatlantic approach to the things. We had speakers ranging from Australia to Canada and the United States. Pretty much we covered quite a lot of Europe, both center, left, south. We have managed to cover pretty much a lot of grounds and to get a lot of perspectives into these topics that truly ask for that. As we discussed, we generally do need a whole of society approaches because we do not have any more of one-line attacks and one-line defenses. It's impossible. It has never been the case, really. But now it's not that visible as it was before. And that's why I was really happy that we can get both the generational approach, the gender balance, which was quite a big agenda for us, and also to get a lot of approaches and thoughts from different backgrounds of people, so we can get that kind of, a very nice assembly and a starting point. So this kind of small conference/workshop kind of worked out in that particular direction, which is a great achievement. And again, I have to just say a massive thank you to my team, Atlantic Forum in general, all of them, Julia, Selene, Marie, Kellen, Willem. You've done an amazing job, and we had like a really long 2.5 months preparing it, but it was absolutely amazing. And again, John, without you and the rest of the team, Elena, we would not be able to pull it off. So thank you so much.
All right. So let's see what comes out of this question. I'm very, very interested in it. And then I think from there we'll just say thank you all for joining us here today. Also from our side, a very big thanks to, of course, the team, which were mentioned, but again also the speakers that, indeed, as you mentioned before, and then the participants, of course, also spend their free weekend to talk about Translantism with us. I mean, it's my way to spend a perfect weekend, really. So yeah, we'll take it from there. So for now, thank you all for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again in April or at one of our small events before that. Thank you.
Yep, quickly from my side as well, as I can see that our votes are coming in. Massive thank you. If we don't manage to go through all of them, because we do have some brainstorming sessions that would also set you up quite nicely for the essay competition that Munich Security Forum has put out, and which is looking exactly into the discontinuities, grey rhinos as the present ones and the black swans as the future, those unknown unknowns, as we were unpacking in all of this weekend. So if you want to engage in that one, by all means, you're more than welcome to do so. And once we all go back to to spring, we can kind of unwrap it and see where it has taken us and how far we come. From my side, it's been an absolute true pleasure to join Atlantic Forum one more time for spring and autumn conference. And I'm looking forward to spring and see what we're going to unpack then for you. Until then, I think that'll be pretty much all from us. If there is anything else that you would like to raise, any questions to ask, we all stand on your disposal. So feel free to ping us. We have the emails which are on Atlantic Forum page. Conference is conference, and then you have info as one more general one. Any questions, by all means, ping us up. And it's been a true pleasure to be with you both backstage and front stage of the last 3.
All right. Good one. Cheers. See you around next time.